Hey there, everyone. Adam Kinakin here with ILET Network, and welcome back to another Instructors Roundtable here on the Tactical Breakdown podcast. Honored to be with you here for another night of conversation. And today, obviously, we're going to be talking about retention and recruitment in law enforcement. But it won't just be applicable to our law enforcement. We're also going to be talking to people in corrections, sheriffs, anybody in the public safety space. I think this is going to be a relevant conversation for you. So hopefully you'll get something out of it as well. And so before I bring the panel on, I just want to let everybody know that obviously there's going to be a lot of updates with the ILET Network as we're going to be launching our platform here very, very soon. We have our founding members that are joining up. We have a few of those spots left, but we're going to be opening up the community platform as a whole. And part of that platform is going to be bringing on experts that you're going to be talking to here today and everyone else that you've seen on our platform in the past. We're really excited about that. So make sure if you're not already to subscribe to the podcast, or if you're watching this on YouTube, subscribing to the channel. If you're watching it on Facebook or LinkedIn, making sure you're following us there, and you're going to stay up to date on all of the stuff that we're doing here at ILET, and really excited for that. The next place you'll see me perhaps if you're going to be at the ILETA conference. That's why I'm rocking the shirt here today. The ILETA conference is in 2 weeks in St. Louis. Obviously, if you're an instructor or trainer in law enforcement, it is the premier event to be at. Definitely highly recommended, and excited that we're going to be doing interviews there. And I actually have the opportunity and the honor to actually speak and present at that conference this year. So really excited to do that. So without any further ado, I'm going to bring on the panel and our experts today, and let's get into the conversation. So here we go. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you guys so much for being here. This is going to be a great conversation. Obviously, we have 6 amazing experts from around the United States with us here today, all with varying backgrounds and experiences, and with their own thoughts on retention and recruitment. And so what I'd like to do before we kick this conversation off is let's go around the horn. Everybody take a 30 seconds, introduce yourself, who you are, what you do, and then we'll jump into the conversation. So Carter, why don't we start with you, my man?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Carter Larry. I am a 21-year veteran with the Bolingbrook Police Department, retired not too long ago. In my time with Bolingbrook, which is just outside of Chicago, Illinois, about 35 miles southwest of Chicago, had an opportunity to do a little bit of everything in my career: FBI task force, DEA task force, worked as an undercover narcotics investigator as well, school resource officer, code enforcement, was on our what most people would call a SWAT team, but we called it a raid, entry, and containment team. Ultimately finished my career as lieutenant responsible for the Office of Professional Standards, which is internal affairs. We delved deeply, working in conjunction with our police and fire board as far as our hiring and recruiting practices are concerned as well. So truly glad to be here right now and look forward to some of your questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Carter. And just a quick point to your background. I think the fact that you've done so many things throughout your career also makes it that's hypercritical when it comes to recruitment, because you're able to share that experience, right?
Yes, sir, absolutely.
That's phenomenal. Mike, go ahead, man.
Thanks. Welcome, everyone. Mike Becar. I'm the executive director of IADLEST. That's an acronym for a very long name, the International Association of Directors of Law Enforcement Standards and Training. So you can see why we just say IADLEST, which primarily is a membership association of all the post directors, the Peace Officer Standards and Training Commissions, who set the minimum standards for the training and the hiring of every law enforcement officer in their state. They're all members, as well as a large number of law enforcement academies and trainers throughout the world. We have about 18 international countries that are also members. My background, I started law enforcement in the late 1960s. Spent 12 years on the street, went to Peace Officer Standards and Training in Idaho. I was raised in California, moved up to Idaho when I was a young boy and fell in love with it. But I went to Idaho Peace Officer Standards and Training, where I was a coordinator, then an academy director, deputy director, and then became the executive director. I was there for 27 years, retired after about 40 years of law enforcement. Couldn't stand retirement, so went to work for IADLEST. I've been here for about 11 years as their executive director.
Awesome. Well, excited to have you here, and for everybody watching this, this is really the first chance that you get to see us and IADLEST work together. And Mike and I have had some conversations over the last couple months, and tried to figure out a way how to connect ILET and IADLEST, because obviously we're trying to support everything that they're doing. They've done a phenomenal job up until this point. So anything that we can do to help bolster your organization and the standards you guys are setting, that's our goal, right? So I'm excited to have you here, and glad that we could finally put this partnership together. So thank you.
Thank you.
Catherine.
Good evening. My name is Dr. Catherine Coleman. I am a board-certified police and public safety psychologist. I own a practice in beautiful Scottsdale, Arizona, and I provide a number of services to the agencies, both here and nationally. So that's going to be everything from pre-employment evaluation, fitness for duty evaluations, in-service trainings. I have really specialized in wellness and resiliency, and working with departments locally and nationally on establishing wellness programs and really supporting officers to their best of their abilities. And I've got some counselors on staff as well that provide counseling as well as critical incident debriefings. So I'm really excited to be a part of this panel because at my role as a psychologist, I have a little bit of a unique perspective when it comes to recruitment and retention, and especially supporting officers and making sure that they have the longest career that they want. So thank you so much for having me, Adam.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad to have you here. And anybody who's followed ILET, you'll know Catherine because she's been on our summits and podcasts before. So appreciate you taking the time and joining me again. It's always awesome to have you here. Brian, go ahead, sir.
Good evening. My name's Brian Grisham. I am recently retired as Tennessee Post Director and Director of the Tennessee Law Enforcement Training Academy. I'm a 41-year law enforcement veteran and an attorney, and the vast majority of my career has been affiliated with the Tennessee Post Commission in different capacities: legal counsel, director, assistant director, instructor, and I've also been a longtime member of IADLEST, and currently am leaving the position of first past president. I'm a past president from 2016 of IADLEST, and I'm going to be joining Mike as his deputy director and working for IADLEST moving forward. So I'm excited to be here tonight. Thank you.
Awesome, brother. Well, I'm glad you're here as well. Thank you. Sarah, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Shendy. I'm here on a dual role. So I've been in law enforcement going on 14 years. The thing that I talk about and rave about the most is that, the uniform from day one has been the love of my life. I've had the opportunity to do some really cool things throughout my career so far. I too have a background in instructing. I was an instructor for OPATA, which in Ohio is the Ohio Peace Officer Training Academy. I did advanced training for 4 years under the Attorney General's office, and all my topics included a lot of community relations, investigating domestic violence, sexual assault, anything that had to do with kids. Forensic child interviewing. I'm also a DARE officer. We mentioned DARE and being a school resource officer earlier. And in June of 2020, Governor Mike DeWine in the state of Ohio put together the Office of Law Enforcement Recruitment. And I'm honored to be the first director of that office, which, as far as we know, is the first of its kind in the country. I'm very happy and honored to be with you all today.
Awesome. Super glad you could join us. And last but not least, Mike, go ahead, brother.
Well, I am happy to be here, and I'm totally impressed by my fellow panelists here. Very knowledgeable in the field. I know a few of them. Hello, everybody. So I'm an international police strategic communications consultant now. So I show police agencies how to leverage social media and dealing with the news media in a positive way, which, as you can imagine, over the last couple of years has become a bigger challenge. I do contract work and consulting work, especially for the U.S. Department of Justice ISATAP, which is the international police training arm that does work for the Department of State. I'm a retired commander with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, where I worked for 32 years. My last assignment was as a commander over all training, including the academy, advanced officer training, personnel, recruitment, retention, all of that kind of stuff. And I had 18 different assignments. When I started the Sheriff's Department, I was a deputy, just like everybody else, worked the jails and patrol, worked my way through a lot of different assignments. And I really enjoy leveraging this information and showing police agencies there are successful ways that you can recruit and retain. I've presented at the IACP conference, National Sheriff's Association, Major County Sheriffs. In April, I'll be at the NALI conference. That's the National Association of Women Law Enforcement Executives. And in May at the IADLEST conference, which you've heard mentioned many times for good reasons because they're awesome. And I'll be at both those conferences presenting on recruitment and retention. And then I'm also the chair of the IACP, International Association of Chiefs of Police Impact Section. That's the International Managers of Police Training Colleges. So I'll be at the IACP conference as well as in October. That's enough.
Awesome. I didn't hear you say you were going to speak at my conference, Mike. You're not invited.
Yeah, what happened?
So, all right. So before we jump into this conversation here, a few quick pointers for anybody who's going to be on this listening. Obviously, there's going to be the live chat. Obviously, our panelists here are going to be having an open discussion. But if you feel like you have any questions, please put it in the chat. And if it is relevant and not out of line, we will probably bring it up and put it out to the panel for your viewing enjoyment. So before we get this thing kicked off and just start diving into questions, I'm going to actually pass this over to Carter, who he and I had a quick conversation before we went live here. Carter just finished running a 2-day retention and recruitment for Caliber Press over the last 2 days. And so obviously this is very fresh for him. And you had mentioned, Carter, that when you guys start off your class, you talk about the why. And so what I'd love to do is just let you start from there, man, and explain that concept, and then we'll use that as a jumping off point.
No, so as it stands right now, one of the struggle, everyone across the nation, every police department across the nation is currently struggling with recruitment. You have some agencies that are seeing anywhere from a 50 to a 65% drop, a reduction in applicants, applying for their respective departments. And so one of the things we ask is, why did you actually get into law enforcement? What's the why? Why did you get into law enforcement? Why did you decide to stay in law enforcement? And we also ask, would you recommend a police career to one of your son or daughter? And if your answer is no, how do you truly expect to go out and recruit anyone to come to your respective agency if you no longer have the passion for the business and are willing to get your own family members into, law enforcement as well? And then with that, we speak towards like reigniting the fire that actually got you into the business so that you can understand the why we want these phenomenal young men and women, from all over our nation come to your respective agency. And then once you can do that, then you're able to kind of push a mantra, amongst your line level patrolmen, because they are actually your greatest recruiters, for any particular organization. But everybody has to be on the exact same page with regards to the why and why are we actually here. And so, yeah, you have a number of officers who at respective agencies across the country who are pretty disgruntled. We're not putting them out there in the forefront, as far as recruitment is concerned. But at the same time, though, you want to get the appropriate people in appropriate faces with the appropriate attitude with recruiting, in people across this country. And then just don't narrow your scope as well, because what I hear is that I hear this all the time. We just have a small pool of candidates that we're working with. We live in the United States. There's no small pool of candidates. You can actually, what you need to do is increase and then kind of spread yourself out there. So I know I kind of went off track there, but hey.
No, absolutely. And I'm going to bring this up, not just because you're from Caliber Press and because I love Scott and Jim and those guys, but Caliber did a poll. Actually, I'm gonna see if I can share my screen here with you guys. I don't know if you guys, has everybody here seen the article that Caliber did from last year, or was it from 2020? About that only 7% of officers would recommend becoming a police officer. So let me see if I can figure out how to share this. And if I can't, that's okay too. But essentially they did this poll, and the poll said that only 7% of officers would recommend becoming a police officer. I think that's probably a massive issue. And my guess is that if that was done in 2020, my guess is those numbers haven't probably gotten much better.
Well,
since then. So maybe Carter, can you maybe speak to that?
Well, no, you think about it. Typically, let's say the class we just provided instruction for, it's 70 police officers, sheriff's deputies, we had dispatchers, but all actually with their respective departments' recruiting teams. And in the group of 70, only 3 people raised their hand. So,
yeah. What does everybody else think of that?
Adam, I want to comment on what Carter just said about the why. I'm a big fan of Simon Sinek, who is one of the world's leading motivational speaker. And, funny enough, it doesn't matter if I'm talking to a group of kids, a group of adults, a group of candidates that I want to recruit, or current law enforcement. I think that we downplay the importance of the why, because I feel like it's the why that keeps us going every single day and ignites that fire. And I know that I did not share this in the beginning. I'm Arab American. I was born in Saudi Arabia. Up until the age of 6, I lived in Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and my family immigrated to the United States at the age of, like I said, around 6 or 7, because my dad happened to get a job offer after finishing his PhD here. So when I get in uniform every single day that I get the chance to work the road, when I see my cruiser, when I tell you that it's love at first sight all over again, I don't care how cheesy that sounds. That is truly how passionate I am about my job and my profession. And a lot of people have noticed it. It's very obvious when you're in love. It's very obvious when you're passionate about something. And Simon Sinek talks about the gold circle. So the outermost ring of the gold circle is what you do. So if you look at, there's 32,000 some officers in the state of Ohio, almost 100,000 officers countrywide. We can all tell you what we do. We're all going to speak the same on that outer circle. The middle circle talks about how we do it. So every state is going to differ. We have the Ohio Revised Code here in the state of Ohio. We have our policies and procedures, our standard operating procedures, everything else. What matters the most is the smallest circle, is why do you do what you do? That's what separates us as officers. And I feel like, my background has really impacted why I do my job and how I do my job. And I feel like, sometimes if you haven't been exposed to what life is like for others. I love how Carter just said, we're in the United States. Like, we are living in the land of opportunity. This country is not great. We have so much room for improvement as a whole society, as a profession, as leaders within law enforcement. There's a lot of room for improvement, but I don't think that people realize the amount of opportunity there is to be seized every single day. And then, how I bait people into the conversation, and I don't know about all of you guys, but, going on 14 years in law enforcement, I have never spoken to a single individual that understands what we do unless they have someone that is in law enforcement within their family. So they have no idea what we do. Why? Because they get their information from the media and movies and just a lot of Hollywood scenery that's not very realistic to our career. And I tell them I'm basically a victim advocate in uniform. So you want to be a victim advocate? Come into law enforcement. You love working with kids? Come into law enforcement. You want to advocate for the elderly, special populations, whatever the case may be, whatever your passion may be, come into law enforcement. And at the end of the conversation, they always say, oh, I didn't know you guys did all that. So, a lot of the things that we do as police officers, the departments that are facing a recruitment crisis right now, I feel like we didn't plan ahead. We went so long being comfortable, not educating people, not engaging every community within our jurisdiction, especially women and minorities, that now when we're kind of in a clutch, a lot of these people aren't coming through because in a lot of jurisdictions, they have no idea who we are. They have no idea what we do. So why would they back you on a bad day or, with all of the civil unrest that took place the last couple of years? So I think we as a society and as a profession definitely underestimate the why. If people knew, people don't trust you, love you, and follow you because of what you do. It's because of why you do what you do. And if people knew how passionate we were about, service for self and community service in general and protecting their kids and protecting their parents, which is like 90% of the job. We don't go around kicking in doors like Hollywood says we do. I think if people understood the why behind being a police officer in the United States of America, that we would never be in a recruitment crisis because people would be trampling over each other to get into this uniform. I'll stop there.
Absolutely. Does anybody want to follow up to that?
It's a hard follow-up because I completely agree with everything that Sarah just said. And I think that this touches in two areas in both the recruitment and the retention piece. So when I'm doing the psych evals, when officers are trying to get hired on the job, one of the questions that I always ask is, why do you want to work for this sheriff's department or this police department or this federal agency? And probably the most common response I get is a canned response, and it's, I want to serve my community. But what I really want to know about is, like, well, okay, but why? Why do you want to serve your community? Was it because, you know, you have family members that were impacted by drugs or got addicted to opiates or were the victim of a crime of some kind? Or do you have a really fond memory of that SRO from high school? And so that's the stuff that, as Sarah was talking about, really kind of speaks to the, why do you want to get into law enforcement? And then on the retention side, it's really typical, and what I see is that officers really lose track of their why. They get so caught up in the negativity and the day in and day out stuff and just people treating them like absolute jerks. In fact, during the summer of 2020, probably anecdotally, 90% of my patients wanted to leave the force. They were ready to retire, or they were just going to quit and move on to something else. Their morale was so low. And I think what departments, and so any executives who are listening, what they need to keep in mind is, what can you do as a department to continue to instill the why in people? How do you keep people around and remind them of the good job that they do? Like, how do you bring them back to that moment where they're a rookie, or those first couple of days of the academy where they're just so excited for this job that's ahead of them?
I have something to add. Is completely agree with my colleagues about the reality of the situation. As far as the action item that I get out of all that is that in a number of different ways, whether it's in group or individuals or whatnot, we need to be able to say in an elevator speech, if you know, the elevator speech is something you can say in the distance of an elevator ride. So 30, 40 seconds, maybe a minute the most. The why that Carter was talking about is, why should this person join your police agency, or why should they not leave your police agency? And it is amazing when I have this discussion and I ask this question, because I ask, depending upon the rank, is, do you work for a great police agency? Do you run as a chief or sheriff? Are you in charge of a great police agency? So what are the unique identifiers of your police agency that would cause someone to want to come to work there? Not like what a couple people commented about, kind of general things that could apply to all law enforcement, specifically your agency. And it's not just about pay, because 90% of the agencies pay less than the highest paid ones. So the point is, sum it up. What is so great about coming to work for your agency? Is it you got a great chief? Is it that you have self-scheduling on your shifts? Did they create a babysitting program for people doing shift work? What's so great about that specific agency? And that's something that needs to be an all of agency approach too, with all of recruitment and retention. And everybody needs to be able to repeat that and post it on your social media and say it at the beginning, middle, and the end of public presentations about what is so great about working for this agency. And if you cannot identify that, and you can't say that, you can't come up with what that is, then you need to get to the drawing board, because that's the very beginning. There you go.
Absolutely. There's a comment in the chat here, and it's fairly lengthy, so bear with me here. Robert says agency leadership steps over their manpower to get to the community in the community policing model. Agency leadership needs to step back and realize that every officer is a member of the community they serve. Peel Principle 7, the community is the police and the police are the community. Agency leadership takes care of the culture and wellness, and every officer will be a positive billboard. Thoughts on that?
No, Robert is spot on. And one of the things that you hear, and I know Dr. Coleman may mention to it with regards to morale being low within agencies. And that was just over the last couple of days, one of the recurring themes that we consistently, heard. And then it's just that we have these officers and people on recruitment teams with absolutely amazing ideas, but those ideas being shot down from the top. And so when you have officers that are out there willing to do good work, but I don't want to use the term incentivized, but there are no rewards, for their effort, and they become disgruntled and it becomes problematic. And then these are the same individuals that are struggling to promote the police department itself, but they are our greatest promoters, for all intents and purposes. So he made an absolutely great point. It is probably one of the biggest issues right now is morale is low. The level of social injustice that has occurred over the last couple of years has been politicized. And then you have that very small percentage of individuals who wear the badge giving the profession a black eye. And this is a Carter Laird statistic. It's not an FBI statistic or DOJ statistic or the Secret Service. I honestly believe that 99% of the men and women who put on a uniform every day are absolutely amazing people and they do the job the right way. It's that 1% that kind of screwed up for the rest of us. But then that there's some carryover into the profession of policing and or law enforcement, whereas that backlash is felt and it kind of reverberates across the entire country. And it, I hate to say the word stinks, but it stinks, for those officers who are trying to do the right thing at the right time, but they lack the motivation now to try to bring people into the profession. When I get people who tell me that, hey, look, police departments need to change. You need to do this. You need to do this. I say, hey, let me stop you. Why don't you join? Why don't you come over to the other side? Why don't you become a police officer? And you can help affect that change as well. So.
To follow up on what Carter said and to kind of answer the question as well, I completely agree. The morale of an agency is the responsibility of its leadership. Officers can bring a good attitude, but ultimately it's really up to the chief and the command level of an agency. And I truly feel for chiefs in this day and age because the profession of policing has become incredibly politicized, and those who are in the position of chief are often be held to city councils or the mayors that hire them in the first place. And so it's unfortunate because, I think a lot of times there's many, many, many good chiefs out there, but there's a lot that have been chasing titles, and there's a lot that forget where they came from. They forget what it's like to put on the badge. They forget what it's like to patrol the streets and to work cases. And they get very focused on what is it going to take for me to keep my job rather than what's it going to take to keep my people happy. And so often I see officers who are willing to go from large, well-known agencies where they're paid good money to go to a smaller agency where they're going to get paid a lot less and maybe the work isn't as exciting because that agency has better morale and they have better support from their administration. And some of the biggest complaints that I tend to hear from officers in regards to morale is things like when there's favoritism, when people are getting promoted that maybe don't have the skills, or who just happen to know the right people, or discipline isn't applied fairly, or when discipline is applied, it's, everything is thrown in the kitchen sink, everything but the kitchen sink. And so people are getting in trouble for stupid little things, or when there's policy changes, every single day that people just can't keep up with. And so I think, administratively, I would like to see chiefs and command level folks really start to take a look at what they're doing for the morale in their agencies, because just as the person who commented wrote, the police are part of the community and the community is the police, and it really should all be part of one.
So I go back to the action items because my colleagues are absolutely right. Clearly, we all in agreement. I think people are watching and listening would agree as well. Amongst the things that you can do as a police leader is to ask your people, don't just ask, why are you leaving before they leave? Ask, why are you staying? And that was mentioned earlier by a couple of my colleagues, but also is not just one-on-one conversations with ask, what do you think would improve things? And cops are rarely silent. about, I mean, they'll gripe and tell you all their gripes and everything, but they may actually have a point. And then you could work towards, especially with some guidance, work towards doing some group discussions and find out that you're not going to be able to solve everything everybody wants. It's just not going to happen. But you might be able to take the edge off it by dealing with some issues, whether it's scheduling or, you know, one of the patrol cars is just beat and they really need it replaced and all that. But most importantly, and this is mentioned in like COPS and PERF and ICP studies and booklets that they've put out, asking, just ask. And I went years and years, maybe a decade, with nobody asking me, hey, what do you think? Or what do you think would improve things? And that's not an encouraging place to be. And this goes way beyond law enforcement, especially generationally speaking, is that the younger generation has been using these their whole lives, and they're used to getting immediate feedback. They're used to commenting and then people saying something back. And we shut them down and treat them the way I was treated as a new deputy, which is, yeah, you know, come back in 5 years when you know something and then we'll listen to your ideas. Just ask in some form or another. It does help if the person that's asking is a supervisor that is not the problem.
So many interesting points here. And I guess I'll be the one to I'll be the devil's advocate in all this. I'm going to pretend to be the disgruntled police officer, I guess. What happens when the officers come up and they say, I understand what you're saying about leadership. My leadership fucking sucks. They don't listen to us. They don't care about us. And they never have our back. In fact, the last two people that got into trouble, they threw them under the bus. What do we do when that situation occurs? What advice and what conversations do we have with those officers who feel like no matter what they do, that their leadership team is never going to have their back?
Well, I guess I'll jump on this one then. Herein lies the reality. So as far as throwing people under the bus, one of the things that back when I was in like night patrol, I was a firm believer in training my staff, whether it be my sergeants and or, you know, the frontline police officer, training them to one day replace me. But we have duties and responsibilities with regards to our general orders. We have duties and responsibilities with regards to state law, state and federal statutes that exist out there. And when our conduct is such where we violate department policy, let alone, Lord forbid, break the law itself, there are consequences for your actions. And then, so if an officer doesn't engage in whether it be aberrant behavior or they violate policy, then there's no chance of them being thrown under the bus. But from a statutory standpoint, if an individual gets suspended for a number of days, is that uncommon, you know, for that violation of the policy? If an individual gets extended days, is that officer even aware of other misconduct that officer may have engaged in, or they may not be privy to it? And we're not in a position to, put another individual officer's information out there in front of everybody, but you try to make them aware and educate them as to the disciplinary side of things. And so, whereas you may think that they were thrown on a bus, but based on what took place in some other extenuating circumstances, it warranted this at this particular point in time. But now let me ask you this. What do you think should have happened, based on this rule violation? What would you have done within that particular set of circumstances? And then we have a dialogue. And, I'll be the first to say that, that's a pretty interesting point. Let me take that under advisement. And that's something I can go to the command staff with and have another conversation with them about, so it just takes a dialogue sometimes, because one of the biggest part of being a police officer, 90% of it is just purely communication, just knowing how to talk to people, being empathetic, being non-judgmental, and then being able to engage, whether it be the police or the people that we serve, out there in the community.
And Adam, I wanted to make a quick comment on a lot of us have been talking about culture and millennials, and I consider myself still millennial, which is great. But I think that it's fair to say that nowadays, in terms of hiring, recruitment, and retention, I feel that the majority of incoming qualified candidates, they want culture over compensation. So, of course, they want the job to pay great. They want good benefits. They want days off and all that other good stuff that we get to enjoy with our job. But I feel like the most important thing and what's at the top of the list is the culture. And that's something that we've been working with a lot of police departments in the state of Ohio to, we're not working to necessarily change their culture, but how are you showing and teaching the community about your culture and your values within the police department? And I think, like I said, that's something that is across the line, regardless if you're, hiring a 35-year-old person that is looking for a career change or a 22-year-old cadet that just graduated from the police academy. So I think the police culture is one of the biggest assets that a police department can have. And then I also wanted to comment on the importance of accountability. And just like I feel like our why is so important, I also feel that when it comes to personal accountability, that is something that is undermined, not just in our profession, but also in our personal lives. And I always think about how, when something goes wrong, whether it's an officer gets in trouble or what have you, many of the challenges that we deal with on a regular basis at work, it's so easy to point the finger at someone else. I feel like that's our first thing to do is whose fault was it? And I feel that if we practice self-accountability and if we realize that sometimes we are a part of the problem, we may not be the whole problem, but sometimes we are a part of the problem. I think that would also change our culture for the better and change our leadership for the better. And, we're talking about leadership and chiefs of police and sheriffs. And in the recruitment world, and when I was an instructor, I made sure the officers knew that every single one of you is a leader. Of course, your rank gives you the foundation to do certain things or gives you certain rights within your police department or on your shift. But in all reality, to other officers inside the police department, whether they're brand new or senior officers, and to the community and to the kids that you work with in the school and to your family, you're a leader. And the more you act like a leader, the more you will perform like a leader. And the more your mentality will change about your actions and your decision-making and how you treat others. I always remind myself and others, in order to change your reality, you got to change your mentality. Your mentality comes first. So I feel like we struggle a little bit with self-accountability. And I love what was just shared about, when officers get thrown under the bus, because I'm thinking of a couple situations where officers were thrown under the bus. And then I'm thinking of other situations where officers were talked to numerous times about the same violation, the same behavioral issue, the same, I was going to say customer complaint, when in all reality, we are in a customer service driven job. And then when discipline actions are needed or taken, it's the department throwing them under the bus, and they fail to take that accountability and step back and, have some reflection on what went well and what could have gone better. And just realizing that, and a lot of times in life, you are where you are because of who you are. It's the decisions that we make every single day. It's how we treat the public. It's how we treat other officers. And despite the fact that our leadership is extremely, extremely, extremely important. And I love how Jeff Bezos said, I'd rather interview 50 people and not hire one person than interview 50 people and hire the wrong individual, because what happens when you bring the wrong person in your department or your business. It's a potentially fatal mistake. But yeah, just a thought on accountability within our profession.
I could jump in on this accountability, hiring the wrong person, and also what Carter said, that it's 1% of the law enforcement officers that give everyone a black eye. And a lot of the police reform, as you know, that everyone's talking about that's been in the news is exactly that, one or two people that have caused all the problem. So if you're hiring law enforcement officers, the first question I would ask you is, do you know who you're hiring? And one of the tools that you should be using whenever you hire a law enforcement officer is the National Decertification Index. We call it the NDI. A lot of people don't even know that it exists. The NDI has been around for 20 years, and it was the post directors who started it 20 years ago to try to prevent problem officers from bouncing from agency to agency, committing some of the same violations, and giving a black eye to law enforcement in general. And so many officers are hired today, and that's never checked. And later we find out, and we've got story after story, that that officer has been decertified and is now committing some of the same violations. The NDI is a free tool. There is no cost. There is no membership required. If you're a background investigator, you just make application to access it. We vet you to make sure, number one, you are who you say you are, and you have a legitimate need to access the NDI for background hiring purposes, and you're given access. There are over 31,000 actions reported to the NDI today by pretty much every state in the United States. The agencies that have the authority to decertify for misconduct are the post commissions. They're the ones who certify or license peace officers, so they're the ones who have the authority to decertify. There's only 2 states right now today that don't have that authority. That's Hawaii and New Jersey. All the rest of them, California just came online. That was one of the biggest states that didn't have it, and they'll be using that authority starting next year. And also Massachusetts just came online. All the other states are reporting to the NDI, and there's about 5,000 to 6,000 officers that now have query access to query the NDI. Another thing that a lot of people don't understand is it's a pointer system. So it's kind of like an NCIC check. When you enter a name of someone that you're thinking about hiring, if you get a hit, first off, you have to look at the full name and the birth date and the other identifying information and determine, is that the same person? And if it is, it gives you the post that decertified that individual, the general reason why they were decertified or suspended or under investigation. There's a lot of different terms that can be in there. And it gives you a number to call and get additional information. So I want to point out that the NDI is not a blacklist. Just because somebody's in there doesn't mean you can't hire them. It's an investigative tool, and it gives you more information to go in and check. And if you want to know more about it, how to gain access to it, and how you get that search ability or what it looks like to do a search, I'm happy to go into that. But I would really recommend that if you're not using it, it's a tool that you should be using, especially if you're hiring law enforcement officers.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Mike. And we're definitely, what we're going to do too is I want to bring up some other uses of that tool. I think that we can address in this, and I think that really is going to be cool to talk about.
Super.
But before, you'll see Catherine jumped off. She was having some issues, and I just want to kind of keep some flow here. So the discipline, the transfer, all that kind of stuff, I have that on my list. But we talked about a few things, and I kind of wanted to stay in the flow on this. And so we've brushed on the fact that there's been priority in the last while on hiring minorities, hiring women, more recently hiring millennials, and now hiring the new generation, right? Which are everybody else besides that. We've had a lot of conversations in the training world about what are the difficulties when I'm training new recruits now versus training in service or somebody who's been around 20, or what it was like training a new recruit 20 years ago versus now. I come from a defensive tactics background, right? So you can imagine when I grew up, fighting was normal. That was a thing. It was completely okay. It happened on the schoolyard. It happened everywhere else. We get into a defensive tactics class, and now we'll get into a DT use of force class with a new frame of recruits, and you say, who here has been punched in the face? And nobody raises their hand. you get up in their face and you ask them, like, has anybody ever yelled at you? Like, has everybody ever been verbally aggressive with you? Well, my dad yelled at me once when I disrespected my mom or whatever it is. And you're like, oh man, we got some work to do. And it's scary because the generation is just so completely different than what we were used to. And so my question is, there's this big push right now that I see, and this is my 10,000-foot view. So please, and I was never in law enforcement, so please take that under advisement as I give this opinion. There's this thought that I have that we're catering to the new generation of people, where we're trying to make policing palatable for them. We're trying to make it enticing for them to join us. But what we're doing is we're also forgetting what are the things that we're looking, what are the things that we need, what are the things that we're looking for that we know officers are going to need. One of those things is the ability to deal with conflict. And there's a lot of issues right now with people that are coming through academies that have never been in conflict, verbal, physical, or otherwise, in their lives. And we're seeing that play out on the streets to sometimes very, very bad results. So I'd love to get your thoughts on that.
Ooh, well, Sarah, I know you're chomping at the bits too. so I'm going to be honest with you. Yeah, you're right. You know, we have to streamline and start recruiting towards very specific, groups. But here's the reality: the millennial generational cohort is the largest generational cohort entering the law enforcement profession today. And so regardless of whether or not, you've had a fight, you've never been engaged in a confrontational argument, you've never seen violence, we still have to bring in good men and women who are capable of doing the job. There are a lot of things that I can teach you, once you come to the streets. We can put you in high stress situations. We can weed out those individuals who may be prone to acts of violence because their conflict management skills are less than what they should be. And then, we can also work with those individuals on shooting, being able to defend themselves, or not escalating the situation to put themselves in a position purely based on ego as well. And so there are a lot of things that can be taught. And so that's not a problem. But as agencies are starting to recruit, they need to start looking at, okay, hey, let me take a step back. First and foremost, everything should be centered around your mission statement and your vision statement. First and foremost, anything that you're doing with regards to bringing new people in should center around that and focus on just that goal itself. And then the type of people you're bringing in should be the type of individuals who are capable of carrying out the duties and responsibilities as a police officer under the guise of both your mission and your vision statement. All right, that gives you the action plan that you need. And I believe it was Mike who mentioned it earlier with regards to an action plan. So I, as a chief of police, I need to step in. I need to determine, one, a short-term goal, because Sarah spoke to this as well, that we're scrambling now to try to bring people in. Well, the problem is that people not having the foresight to put a strategic plan in place where we have short-term, midterm, and long-term goals with regards to bringing people within the organization. And in the midst of all of that, because I'm recognizing, like, we're out here in California representing Caliber Press right now, they will poach from other agencies, and they make no bones about trying to steal the best candidates away from other police departments. Well, what do I do as a chief of police to keep you within my particular organization? But, I want to come back to your point, Adam, that a lot of what we do can be learned. It can be taught. And I can teach someone to defend themselves. I won't say fight, but to defend themselves. I can teach someone not to engage or escalate a situation. I can teach someone how to be safe. I can teach someone the necessary tactics to engage a hostile environment. But what I can't teach are who I can't teach are those individuals who purely, for whatever reason, may have some sociopathic issues, may somehow slide past a psych eval and come into our organization and then prove to be a problem child. And so, which is huge with a field training process. We try to weed out those individuals as early as possible so that they don't, lead us down the road of litigation or along those lines. And I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, and I'm going to let Sarah jump in here in a second, but I just want to kind of cue Catherine up for after Sarah, because this assessment component is pretty much spot on her wheelhouse. So I just want to cue her up that as soon as Sarah's done, I'm going to, Catherine, I'll let you run. And then I also want to bring up an assessment tool that was mentioned to me by Dr. John Black on a conversation I had with him a few days ago, called Insight Assessment. And so what I'm going to do is I'll let Sarah say her thing, and then I'll kick it over to Catherine.
Adam, I smiled when you mentioned change with a negative connotation to it. Because what are the two things that law enforcement hates? Change and the way things are. And I think it took me a while to look at change as a good thing. And I know that one of the biggest factors of success to us as human beings in general is how quickly you adapt to change. And I will tell you, when I was at Opata, I taught a 2-week class that nobody else wanted to teach, and it was called Instructional Skills. And I wanted to rename the class and call it The Art of Communication and Facilitation. Any police officer in the state of Ohio that wanted to teach in a basic academy or that taught in-service training had to go through this class. It was mandatory if you wanted to teach at a basic academy. So this class taught you how to teach. And I'm not trying to evade responsibility here, but it really explained to me why I did so poorly in college in some classes and I did so well in others. I am not the type of person that can sit in an auditorium with 300 other people and be lectured to. I don't learn. I'm thinking about a million other things I have to do that day, and my attention span is that of a goldfish. And I'm just being completely honest. And if you think about law enforcement, that we are hands-on learners. We're kinesthetic learners. Some of us are visual learners. Some of us are auditory learners. But I don't know too many officers that would be receptive to learning via sitting in an auditorium with 300 other people, because a lot of us like that one-on-one attention. So after taking that class and teaching it so many times and reflecting on like my college career, I felt a little less responsible for how poorly I did sometimes. And like I said, I take responsibility for how much work I did or didn't do. But the point is, when it comes to FTOing, and I just said this to one of my best friends yesterday, when I'm in public, I realize how much people don't know how to communicate. They do not know how to communicate. And I'm saying this like walking through a grocery store or being at the gym. It doesn't matter, the age of the individuals that are in my presence. I feel like, in terms of nonverbal communication, which is so important to our survivability as law enforcement officers, our presence on calls alone is on the use of force continuum for a reason. And if we're unable to teach that correctly or to relay that information, not how we best teach, but how they best learn, I think we're going to have a problem. And I don't think it's fair. I think as a field training officer, as instructors, as leadership within our departments, it's incumbent upon us to make sure that we're teaching in the most effective and the most productive way for that individual to learn. So I was laughing when you said something about change. I'm like, man, everybody thinks change is such a negative thing, when in all reality, when we talk about change, not just as someone benefiting on the other side, but we could also grow as individuals and professionals when we learn how to do things differently.
Awesome. Yeah. And before I tee Catherine up here, to your point, I don't know if anybody's seen this, but our entire slogan here at ILET is #change the standard. So change is something that we're very comfortable with, and because change, like you said, isn't negative. Evolution is something that has to happen. Every organism on the planet has to evolve, or at some point they're going to become extinct, right? This is no different. Corey asked a question, and his question was essentially, is there is there any weight to the idea that people learning about conflict resolution prior to being law enforcement, so being able to diffuse and deal with situations as a peer-to-peer rather than as a police officer to a subject without having that command authority, essentially, is there weight to that before they actually get in and do their training and things like that? Another point that I want to bring up, which I find very interesting, is that training and recruitment are always very interesting, especially when something happens with an officer down the road. Usually what will happen is, as a trainer, we'll say, well, who are they hiring? Because whoever they're sending us suck. That's why we couldn't train them well enough, and that's why that bad thing happened. And conversely, the people that are doing the recruiting say, hey, we sent you good applicants. You can't train for shit. That's why whatever bad happened. And it's this back and forth between hiring and training. And so the last thing I'll say before I let Catherine loose on this is, in training, the two things that we've identified and what we're going to be focusing on here at ILET are two critical things. And it's not identifying what skill set we need to teach. We're not teaching, a specific grip, shooting stance, a way to use a baton or a defensive tactics technique, or a checklist on how to conduct an interdiction. That's not what we focus on. There's two things that we want to focus on: decision-making and critical thinking. If I can get an officer to make decisions and to think critically before, during, and after a situation, all of the cool tactical stuff, really, it's not that big of a deal anymore. So that's kind of a lead in to this insight assessment tool. And Catherine, I don't know if you're up to speed on this. If not, I'll leave it and let you talk first, and then I'll bring it up after. But those are just some thoughts that I have based off of this. So off to you.
Thank you. I have no idea what the insight assessment tool is, so I'm excited to hear about it too. And I like that you're just like letting me out like a feral cat, like talking about like what I'm like, here, just talking about psych assessment. So here's the thing. So the pre-hire psych is such a unique part of the hiring process, and but there's some problems with it. And one of them is that there's a lot of people who are doing them that are not competent. Like the way that we get hired by departments to do them is oftentimes it's the lowest bidder, and sometimes the lowest bidder doesn't have qualifications. When we're doing a pre-hire psych, we're not necessarily looking at whether an officer, is mentally ill or not. I mean, that's certainly a component of it, but we're looking if they have, any attributes personality-wise or pathologically that would prohibit them from performing essential functions. And the reality is that most people, most police officers are psychologically quite healthy. Now, I can't speak to like the end of their careers, but when they are getting hired, like they are quite healthy. And if you were to compare scores on psychological tests between law enforcement officers at the beginning of their career and the general population, law enforcement officers would be pretty low on every score. They would look very emotionally stable. And so people who are doing these assessments that really don't have adequate training behind them are oftentimes passing people simply because they appear psychologically healthy without taking into consideration things like their impulse control, anger management, their ability to manage frustration and stress, their judgment and decision making, their interpersonal abilities, their integrity, things like that. These domains that are crucial to the law enforcement profession. And so that's one of the problems. The other problem is that the psych assessment really serves as a rule out rather than a rule in. So we're essentially looking for people that are going to be bad and kicking them out of the process, rather than people that have the qualities and the attributes that are going to add to a department or that are going to be a good fit. And the problem is that there's just not a whole lot of research behind tools that do that, especially when you compare it to the rule out process. And then the last thing that I think can be an issue is, a lot of departments have kind of an old school way of thinking. A lot of departments, they want to hire who they want to hire. And a lot of times they think that the work that psychologists do in this pre-hires is just kind of a bunch of bullshit, that we're just like, giving these tests and they don't really mean a whole lot. When the fact of the matter is that there's 60 plus years of evolving research behind psychological testing. And there's so much research behind the interview process, especially these pre-hire processes when they come to police. officer hiring. I was the chair of the last pre-employment guidelines for IACP. And, even though the last pre-employment guidelines were only, 4 years before that, there was so much research in the meantime about, what's going to be best practices for these. And so I would encourage departments who don't have this process to really look into doing it, and then really assess who you're using to do this. Make sure that they have an understanding of the culture of your department, so that even when you have those candidates that maybe they psychologically are fit and they're able to check all the boxes, that they can still have that conversation with you where it's like, hey, this guy's a little bit of a weirdo. Maybe you should, look into a couple of things on the side, because that's really important. And I think that's how we're going to get really good people in departments, is really having this good relationship between psychologists and the rest of the department.
Awesome. Absolutely. Before we continue on with that point, Carter, I know, has to jump on an airplane. So, Carter, I appreciate you being here, brother. But I want to give you a second to kind of give your final thoughts on this before you take off.
No, as it stands right now, the issue with regards to recruiting for law enforcement agencies is at a critical stage. And you have departments that are offering up to a $30,000 signing bonus in order to incentivize people to come out and at least at a minimum apply for their respective agency, let alone be hired. All I would offer is for those law enforcement leaders that you have to be forward thinking. You have to think outside the box, and you have to be creative with how you're bringing people into or recruiting individuals into your organization. We had a conversation actually yesterday in the class we taught, and one of the things that was pointed out, for those who had an opportunity to watch the Super Bowl, the most popular commercial, during the game itself, was a commercial that just purely had a QR code on there. And then everyone was scrambling to, see where did it actually take you to. And it was like some Bitcoin organization. But it was phenomenal and it was simple. And there are some strategic things that you can do to entice the millennial crew to recruit women, to recruit minorities, to recruit just amazing human beings out there. But you have to be forward thinking and then be willing to step outside your comfort zone and do some things. So with that, Adam, I really appreciate you and to this amazing panel. It's been a joy listening to each and every last one of you. And to everybody out there, please stay safe.
Thanks, man. Appreciate being here. Looking forward to touching base with you when you land. So have a safe flight, and we'll see you soon.
Will do. Talk to you, Adam.
Let me jump in and put on my academy director half of my career, and just kind of reiterate what Corey brought up. It's not just conflict resolution, but it's many skills that the basic recruits have to be retrained in. I mean, physical fitness, physical education is an elective in many grade schools. While we have to indoctrinate newer recruits into different communication skills, they come in with the HDG mindset. I learned that from one of my counterparts in Indonesia. He calls them the head down generation. We have to retrain them in interpersonal skills on the very front end, and realize that they're going to deal with generations that don't want to text to a person in the same room. They want eye contact. They want notes being taken. Then embrace the technology later on in their training cycle. Along with physical fitness, the before mentioned inability to have ever experienced being yelled at by someone. It's such a broad spectrum, and it's not that the hiring pool is weak, as he just said, that there's a lot. This is a big country, and there's a lot of recruitment to be done out there. But what is brought to the academy I directed for many years, the largest academy, training 500 to 600 recruits a year, is less qualified candidates in recent times. So recruitment is just at a critical impasse right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point, before we continue on with that, Catherine, I know you also have a hard out here, so I want to give you a chance to kind of share your thoughts on this conversation and this whole topic as a whole. Oh, you're muted. Always one person. There's always one.
Yeah, I try to be quiet and be respectful for everyone else. Thank you, Adam, for having me. I'm not going to share a whole lot because I feel like I've talked so much already, but I really appreciate being a part of this panel, and I wish I could stay a little bit longer, especially as we get into, talking about retention a little bit more and morale and resiliency. And, I may be biased, and I'm gonna throw this out there, but, of course, I think that, having wellness initiatives and making sure that officers are taken care of, mind and body, is one way to keep officers on the job and make sure that they want to stay with your department. So I'm just going to throw that tidbit out there, and hopefully one of my co-panelists will kind of pick up on that and share their thoughts a little bit later as you guys get into that discussion. But again, it was really wonderful to be a part of this panel. Adam, thank you so much. It was incredible to learn from all of the other co-panelists, and I hope that you invite me back someday.
Well, I mean, absolutely. And for anybody who's tracking on this, Catherine actually did a full session on mental health and retention and a lot of other things for the last ILET summit. So
betrayal trauma.
And yeah, so there's a lot of information there that we have access to as well if you want to pick her brain some more. So Catherine, thank you so much as always for joining us, and looking forward to speaking with you soon.
Have a good one. Good night, guys.
All right. Look at this. We're getting down. We're dwindling. Our ranks are shrinking. That's okay. We'll be okay. Great points, Brian, by the way. I think this is so interesting, this conversation, especially as we move into the kind of the conversation of retention, especially in law enforcement. I mean, I think that if I had spoken with when I was down in Chicago last week, I had the opportunity to swing by a few PDs where I knew some people there, and I was speaking with one lieutenant, and he said, and their problem right now is they're hiring people left, right, and center, and there's two main reasons. One is they had a hiring period about 25 years ago where they brought on a good percentage of their force, and now they're all timing out. So they're like, we need to backfill, and they're coming up against it. But the problem is that usually in that situation, there's going to be some people that are like, I'll hang out an extra couple years just to, make sure this transition goes okay so that you guys aren't going to get slammed. But because of the current state that we're in right now in this industry, they're like, you know what? I'm punching my ticket. I'm out. Like, there's no reason for me. Listen, I understand I'm putting you guys in a rough spot, but I'm bound. Like, I'm popping smoke. I'm out of here. What is there a way right now? I mean, there's a lot of experience here on this panel, and please do not take that the wrong way. But there's a lot of experience on this panel. What can we say to those guys and girls that have been in 20, 25 plus years, that, like, how do we keep them on that little bit longer? Is there a need to do that? Should we be doing that? And how can we accomplish that? What conversations are we having?
Adam, I think that we talked a little bit about this earlier when we talked about revisiting your why and kind of rekindling the flame of why you got into the profession to begin with. And everything we've talked about so far in terms of the culture in the police department and the leadership is extremely relevant to the conversation. But again, I go back to, not just accountability, but we are all individual officers, and why we stay in uniform one more day, I think, is completely up to us. And I hesitate to use the word legacy, but I'm going to use it. And I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with Blue Courage. I'm a Blue Courage instructor. And we always talk about the dash. Okay. So you have the year that you were born, dash the year that we pass. And when you think about the dash, a lot of people say, like, oh, what do you want people to say after you're gone? How do you want people to remember you after you're no longer here? And my thing is, why can't we have those conversations? Why can't you see your legacy live out while you are still here? And I think that people lose touch of the amount of influence that you can have on other individuals, on other families and other members of their community every single time you're in uniform. I don't care if you work in a 5-man department or a 500-man department. We as police officers shouldn't wait for that oh crap call where we're kicking in doors and dragging people out of fires and car accidents and all this other stuff. Of course, that, saving lives per se is a great thing to accomplish, and you go home feeling a whole different kind of exhilarated. But what about following up with victims? What about walking through the school and eating lunch with that one kid that everybody bullies and picks on? What about following up with that mom that you met on a domestic violence call and checking up on her and her kids and seeing if they need anything? There's so many things that we can do every single day as a police officer in uniform. I always remind people, your talent, whether it's compassion, empathy, communication, your talent is God's gift to you. What you do with that talent is your gift back to God. So every single day we're in uniform, whether you work 8-hour shifts, 10 or 12, what are you doing? What are you doing with your life? What are you doing with your time? I'm not worried about like stats and, stopping vehicles and all this other stuff. If that's your thing, then great, because different things fuel us. But I think that we lose sight of that every single day is an opportunity for you as a person to grow, for you as an officer to grow. But people in the community, the large majority of people in the community love and support public safety, and they love and support their police department. The large majority does. So, how we use that time on the road, regardless if it's rain or sunshine outside, that's what builds our community bank account. And God forbid, when really bad things happen around the country or within your hometown or within your jurisdiction, it forces people to give you the benefit of the doubt because they know who you are as a person. They've seen you talk to their kid. They've seen you, checking up on their grandma. They've heard about you doing such great things in the community. And if you, I can't even imagine going to work and not having that mentality, because that would be draining. You are going to achieve burnout if you focus too much on the noise. There's so much unnecessary noise that happens around us, whether it's people complaining about shift work, about bids, about days off, about not getting their vacation time, which I'm not saying that those are all minor issues, because those are all very serious things that we, need for them to work out in order for us to achieve happiness, if you will, within our departments. But that's not what we signed up for. We didn't say, okay, I swear to the Constitution of the United States of America and the state of Ohio, pending I get my days off, pending I get weekends off, pending whatever happens. That's not how the oath worked. We took an oath, and I feel like every single time we're in uniform, we need to revisit that oath. And I know, it's very difficult to stay in this profession for 20, 25 years. And I think about that in terms of the direct and the vicarious trauma that we witness as human beings. It would definitely make it hard. On top of that, if you work under bad leadership, that would definitely make your life hard. But my drive is not anything that's going on around me. My drive and what gets me in the uniform and what gets me to be so happy and thankful and grateful to be in the cruiser one more day is knowing that I have impacted people's lives in a positive way and wanting to see my legacy while I'm still here. Being with the same department for 13 years, it is so awesome that some of the kids that I've had in Safety Town when they were pre-K, I've attended high school graduations, I've attended weddings. I just went to a baptism a couple of weeks ago, and you become a part of these people's families. And I don't know what's greater than that. I think that's why I think this job is so honorable. And it's really a privilege to be a police officer in America nowadays.
Hey, Sarah, quick question. Do you do recruitment by any chance? Okay, sorry. Was anybody want to jump in on that, Mike?
Yeah. I'll add the well-said statements that have been making the action items, because you can tell I focus on action items as well as laying the groundwork of what we're hearing is that why stay? We ask, I mentioned this earlier we ask, why did so-and-so leave? Why stay? Myself and almost everybody I talk to that would have potentially stayed, nobody has talked to them in years to say, hey, why do you stay? And what do you think it would take to have you stick around for a couple more years? They're not even being asked the question. And this is universal. It's almost 100%. And that that have said to me, I would have stuck around for another year or two, but with all the misery that's going on, forget it. And then I ask them, I say, well, if somebody had come to you and said, hey, would you stick around for another year or two? People volunteer because they're asked. And sometimes even when you're at the end of the road, you can go a little bit more, but nobody's asking. These same officers, as a general rule of various ranks, haven't had a written evaluation in years. They haven't been offered to go to a training of their choice in years. And there is probably the biggest glaring error, I'll tell it this way, is that I ask rooms of chiefs and sheriffs, I ask them, do you have someone who's in charge of recruitment for your agency? Now, this is large, medium, small agencies. The biggest agencies, they have recruitment people. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about an agency that is more of the average size of a police agency in the U.S. of 15 to 50 officers. Say, is it somebody's, even though it's not their full-time job, is there a designated person who's in charge of recruitment? And in a room full of 100, 130 chief executives, I'll ask that question, and it's less than 10% even have someone designated, a supervisor designated, who's in charge of recruitment. So here's this crisis. Everybody's talking about this crisis. Not only do we don't have a written plan, we don't even have anybody in charge of it. And then the worst is if you say someone different than your recruitment person, has to be a different person, even if it's a small agency. And it's not good if everything's the chief, the sheriff's job, because they got a million things going on, they can't do it, is who's in charge of retention. And that's more like 1% will say that somebody is actually designated in charge of retention. And what that person would be dealing with and focusing on is the things that my colleagues are talking about, is to address these gaps. And like, I haven't gotten an evaluation. I want to go to training. So I got my percentage. I'm just going to leave. And so my point is there is something that can be done, but we haven't done that in the past. And I think that there is I don't know what to call it, a hidden hesitation maybe is the nicest way I can say it, because my generation saw going up to, an officer and saying, hey, what do you think about this? Or going to a retiree and say, hey, why don't you stick around? Like it's some kind of sign of weakness on both persons' parts, right? When the fact remains is that expectations have changed. And the expectations really of all generations is that they will be listened to, they will be asked their opinion. And even if they don't get what they want, at least somebody listened to them. So that's my summary of an action item from that.
Let me jump in too and say something. Sarah talked about Blue Courage, and we facilitated a lot of the Blue Courage classes a couple of years ago. And those are tremendous classes. They teach you about yourself and how to make a difference, as Sarah mentioned, and the nobility of policing. And she's absolutely right. Most of the public supports law enforcement. It's just a very, very few that don't. Then those are the ones that are making all the noise. And the problem is that law enforcement, the longer you're in it, you're dealing with that small minority of people who don't respect the police, who don't abide by the law. And pretty soon you start feeling that everybody's like that. And so many times I've talked to police officers that have left law enforcement, they've retired, and all of a sudden they go down to the grocery store and they see a different type of people. They see the ordinary people, not the people they were dealing with all the time, and starting to realize that everybody's not like that. But if you get a chance to go to a Blue Courage class, I would really encourage it. The biggest thing I hear from some of the attendees is they go to a lot of training and they're told how to do this and how to do that. But that training is about them individually and how to be a better person. And as Sarah said, there's so many opportunities you have out there to make a difference. And if you talk to anyone, absolutely anyone, they can remember a traffic stop or a intervention with a police officer. Everyone has a memory, and sometimes it's good and sometimes it's not. And that is the impact that you can make. You have no idea that you're doing that, but they're going to remember that the rest of their life. And so many young individuals anymore that have a very positive impact from a police officer, they end up going into law enforcement because of that. And they talk about it. this person, the way they treated me, made so much of a difference that I wanted to go into law enforcement and make a difference. So you can do that. And I think that needs to be stressed more and more, especially for the older recruits, to get outside the box, associate with people besides other police officers, so that you can see that there are some great people out there, and the vast majority of people do support what you do.
Brian, any thoughts?
Certainly, that's something we've been very active in, and I'll reiterate what the good doctor said about officer wellness. We've got 3 major networks here in Tennessee that support officers in critical incident debriefing, peer support, and then taking that look at oneself as an officer, as a public servant, and not just the warrior mentality that we seem to adopt for so many years. It's a real telling thing. At our academy, we began with ethics and ended with ethics, and I strongly believe that ethics is caught, not taught. We're not going to be able to teach them how to be ethical, but it can be a constant dialogue, and how important that is for each officer in their career, for longevity's sake. I also noticed one person saying, why do we not encourage, Robert said, why do we not encourage officers to retire at 20, 25 years? That's something that we see a lot of variation, and a lot of the reason for the turnover in our state and in the states that I've monitored. We are at that impasse that you mentioned earlier, that my contemporaries are aging out and starting to retire. Another third are disillusioned, and yet another third have pension programs that are changing drastically. So there's a myriad of reasons why there's a higher turnover rate now. But why do we not? Our state in particular does have an early retirement system that encourages officers and recognize the reality that veteran officers tend to die fairly quickly after a long career. And that's kind of the genesis beside the statutory authority for early retirements here.
That's a super interesting thought. And another part of Robert's point there, the very next line was, what if we treat it like the military? If you're not moving up, it's time to move on. I bring it back to my time in the forces. There's something called a career captain or a career corporal for a reason, right? It's the people that are just, that's where they're happy. That's, there's certain officers that we know that they don't want to move up. They don't want that added responsibility. And maybe it's because they love maybe they love patrol. Maybe that's what they want to do day in and day out. And I saw this thing on LinkedIn a while ago. There's this old gentleman, and I don't know where he is, but he's in like his 60s, and he's been on for like 45 years, and he still does patrol. And I don't know where that is, but that's a passion. Those are the types of people that create that engagement that you guys were talking about, that they're the ones that are going to have that interaction with that new generation where they go, that officer was so awesome. I want to be able to do that, to help serve my community like that. And so I think that's a fine line we walk, to say we have to be very cognizant of the stress and the pressure that officers are put under each and every day. And monitoring their mental health, and making sure that we're not putting them into a situation where we know that, 3 years after retirement, they're going to try to start a pistol. We don't want that situation. So we have to monitor that. But at the same time, we shouldn't try to be dissuading people who are wanting to stay on and serve their community in something they love doing, dissuading them from doing that as well. So interesting point, but I just, in my head, I was like, career captain, career corporal. There was corporals that I knew that were much, much more proficient than most of the senior sergeants or warrants that we had, because they'd been around doing the same job for 25 years. Right. So anyway, I'll leave that where it is. I'll get your guys' thoughts on that.
Adam, I wanted to talk about something that you said before.
Uh-oh.
when we were talking about, I think it was, I don't know, someone said it, how some of the new cadets that we have coming into the police academy have never been yelled at, never been in a fight, all this other stuff. And it really made me think about, who are we recruiting? And I love the idea of like hiring for attitude and training for aptitude. I can't tell you how much anxiety and just like negative feelings I get from certain civil service processes or entry exams, if you would. And I always share with everybody the fact that when I graduated from the police academy, I'm not a good test taker. Okay. I'm just not. If it doesn't have to do with criminal justice and the justice system and police stuff and thin blue line stuff, I'm not passionate. And a lot of times I don't care. Okay. So like social studies, math, science. Information. But out of the academy, I took 2 civil service exams. One of them, I was at the top 2% of the police department, a very large police department. One of them, I got a 64%. And when I was in the testing room, I actually looked around to see if I was in the right room. So in terms of like recruitment, I think that as a profession, we do a lot of things that make us miss out on really good people. So we're talking about, handling challenges and adversities and being able to de-escalate situation and like dealing with adversities in life. And I know that you have all encountered people, really good people, young and old, that just don't know how to deal with challenges. They don't know how to deal with having a bad day. And I'm not talking about, traumatic incidents, and I'm not downplaying anything, but to them, a challenge or any kind of adversity is enough to level them for a day or for a week, and mentally they're just ruined. And if you think about it, within our communities, who is most likely to have grown up with the most challenges, the most adversity, is some of our minority communities, whether you're talking about lower income neighborhoods that have had to deal with everything from poverty to growing up in areas where they've experienced gang violence, to immigrant communities. And I'm, speaking about the Middle Eastern and Muslim community because I'm from the inside, and I tell police departments all the time that if you're dealing with like a good conservative Muslim that is Arab American, that was born and raised in another country, especially females, you're automatically getting a female with great communication skills, great de-escalation skills, a master's degree, and is bilingual or trilingual. That's foundational. That's standard. And that's me and my group of friends. And that is one group of many that we're missing out. I talk to kids from like inner city schools, from Akron, from Canton, from surrounding areas on traffic stops and on calls, because they always ask me like, how did you get into law enforcement? And they're like, I can never be a police officer because, and they give you a reason why they feel that they can never be a police officer. And I tell them that everything that you're treating and thinking of as a liability is really an asset to you as an applicant and to the police department, especially young adults that have faced challenges and adversities in their life. Their outlook on life is very different. They know how to deal with challenges. They pick and choose their battles really well when it comes to not getting what they want. And they do great dealing with people and relating with people that are going through crisis. And I feel like that's a group of people that can be phenomenal in terms of being an asset in law enforcement, but it's also the group of people that we're missing out on the most because of lack of communication. They don't have a card maybe to get to the testing site, and the police department they're interested in, doesn't have like an online testing network. Like something is putting a stop to the process of them getting into law enforcement, not to mention the average cost of the police academy, which is $5,500 to $7,500.
Interesting. This goes so far outside my wheelhouse. I'm having no joke. That's so, I don't know. There's been an interesting question here. Leo was asking, if academies offer recruits, so Leo teaches a lot about addiction. And so he's wondering, about trauma and things like that. So people that are applying with and Leo, you may have to expand on your point here, brother, but I don't know if he's asking if we do training on addiction in mental health, which we do. But I wonder if he's asking if we actually screen for addiction during the recruitment phase. And if so, if that's going to be a disqualifying factor, or should it be a disqualifying factor? And obviously, Catherine's not on the call anymore. She would be the one to go to on that probably, but I'll leave it up. But Brian, maybe you have something to add to that?
Yeah, ILET was very involved, both in the current reform discussions, but also in the 21st century policing effort. There was major symposiums related to pre-employment standards. It's one of the very important things that post-commission entities do is ensure pre-employment standards for officers, and that's one of the big discussions nationwide. Is there a willingness to forgive past drug use? Certainly, there's a need to regulate current drug use, but our agency's willing to look at candidates that might not have been included in the past. As far as other pre-employment standards like minimum age, we have a lot of major metropolitan areas in Tennessee, but primarily we're a rural state. And if you were to just across the board raise the minimum age requirement, I wouldn't be sitting here right now. I was 19 years of age when I started in law enforcement, and I was mature enough to do the job. Not everyone is, but I had that chance. So these are topics at the national level. And I do see a relaxation of past drug use and pre-employment hiring standards.
It's an interesting point, and I don't want to misspeak to this, but obviously the U.S. hiring for law enforcement is very different the way you guys do it than pretty much everywhere else in the world. There's a lot of differences there. One thing that I will say, so for example, in Canada, pre-employment drug use is not necessarily a disqualifying factor as long as there isn't a history of it leading up to your application, right? So usually what'll happen is if, and I hope somebody will reach out and correct me if I'm wrong on this, and if you do, send me an email and I'll correct myself later. But say for example, you use drug use in your teens, whether it was marijuana or other recreational type drugs, which is obviously legal now in Canada, so that's not even an issue anymore. But say so say you were using something different, maybe it was Coke, whatever. As long as there'll be a cutoff date, and so you cannot apply to be in law enforcement. So you'd have to have a dry period, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, whatever the agency requires. And then once you meet that threshold, you can apply. And then obviously during their hope is that it's caught during either the psychological assessment or the polygraph, or whatever it is to prove that that you are no longer been using drugs up until that point of your application. Is that kind of the way it works in the US as well? Or how does it work with you guys, just so that I'm tracking on that?
Well, I can tell you that if someone used cocaine, they're probably not gonna make it into uniform, only because you're talking about a very illicit drug. And of course, every single police department is different. We always say in Ohio, there's 88 different counties. So there's 88 different ways to do things. On top of that, there's 961 police departments in the state of Ohio alone. So a offense or an arrest or prior drug use could definitely disqualify you from one department, but not necessarily the next. And like I said, I don't want to say that I'm 100% sure, but I'm 99.9% sure that, say if a 30-year-old admitted to using cocaine at the age of 17 or 18, I do believe that the majority of police departments would consider that a disqualifier, given the fact that marijuana has been decriminalized in the state of Ohio. It is not legal for recreational use, but it went from a first-degree misdemeanor to a minor misdemeanor. They have shown leniency on that, similar to what you said, as long as it's not, doesn't butt up to them going to the academy. But more illicit drugs, I think that's going to be a problem for the applicant.
Yeah, I'm gonna add a caveat to that. I may have been incorrect using cocaine as the example. So, like I said, if I was off on that, I apologize. But the reason I bring that up for an example, I always found there to be, and this is a personal opinion at this point, but I always found there to be something off on the fact that, say for example, when you're going through your application process for somebody who's coming in, it's have you ever been arrested or charged with a crime? Right? Yes or no? No. But have you ever done something and not been arrested or caught? Right? And because, especially in Canada, because you're going through a polygraph, people will go like, yeah, I've had a drink, I've driven after I've had a few 2 drinks. I didn't know if I should or not, those types of things, right? But for example, there was always something to me that was off when I know that, drinking and driving is a crime. I know I shouldn't do it. But we have a lake in northern Saskatchewan, right? To get there, it's about 2 hours, and then you're off on a grid road for 20 minutes, and then you turn off onto like an individual road that takes us to our cabin that no one isn't on. It's a private road, right? When we get there, sometimes we're driving up to the lake. Sometimes at that point, we hit the road, we crack a beer, and we're having a beer on the drive up to the lake. That now, I know I have to disclose that, and automatically disqualifies me from applying to be a police officer for 2 years. That I always found weird. And kind of just, it was just frustrating to me. Obviously not for me, because I can't be a police officer because I screwed my back up in the military. But it always bothered me that could be a factor that would take somebody like me completely out of the running just because of those standards. And so my question to you guys is, where do we start? I understand there has to be a line, but are we too rigid with these lines that we've drawn? Should there be more gray area? And if there is, how do we start accounting for that?
That's always a difficult question. And one of my commissioners used to always say, anytime you establish a line, it's going to go right down someone's back. There's always going to be that situation. So it's very, very difficult. But I'm not sure what the standards are in Canada, but in the United States, one of the problems we have is there's 50 states, and so they're doing the same thing 50 different ways, is what I like to say. They all have standards on drugs, but they're all a little bit different. And the states are battling that all the time. They're pretty consistent on the hard drugs like cocaine, heroin, psychedelics, but they're really struggling with cannabis, marijuana, because of the various states that are now legalizing it. And so how strict can they be? Some of them are starting to relax some of that. But what they're also dealing with is police officers. If it's legal to smoke marijuana recreationally, then why can't a police officer do that? Well, there's a different standard. Those are our national discussions all the time. But Adam, one thing I can tell you that maybe might help, especially for those young men and women that might be applying and run into that situation that you were talking about. You're on this private road up to your cabin, but you open the beer, and the state law prohibits that, so you've got to disclose it if there's a polygraph, and that might prohibit you. In almost every state, yes, they do have hard standards, but a lot of them are appealable. You can appeal it to the commission and state your case. In a situation like what you're talking about, there might be some pretty good circumstances, and I see a lot of those situations waived. And so there, even though there's a rule, there's some leeway that are given in most of the states, at least in the United States, to get by with some of that stuff, as long as it's not egregious and there's some very good extenuating circumstances.
Yeah, I certainly agree with Mike. And this issue of marijuana, in my lifetime, it went from being a felony to have a small quantity to where now it's you don't even get a ticket.
Yeah.
And so now there's a marijuana clinic a couple miles from my house. And so so things have changed, times have changed. One of the issues having to do with marijuana use is that it may be legal in California for that possession, small amount, but it's still a federal crime. And so, how do you address that? Or at least it was. I think it still is, whether it's enforced or not. So then I look at a comparative like when I was in high school, which is a couple of years ago, DUIs were still a joke. People would joke, oh, yeah. And when I was in college, oh, man, Bill got a DUI. Oh, man, that's messed up. Sorry to anybody named Bill there. That's messed up. But it was still kind of a punchline and a joke, as a joke. In a decade's time, it flipped to where it was shameful because the script got flipped to, you get a DUI, that's just like, you could have killed somebody. You could have killed my child. And part of what happened was MAD and the police teamed up with media and otherwise to put the word out that, hey, you drink and drive. Here's a mother that's lost her daughter. Here's a father that doesn't have, a dad, and so on. And so that's part of that messaging of what making something unacceptable and making something acceptable. We have an issue with on-duty officers getting a DUI. Should they be fired? And then, and if not, how many do they get before they get a pass? And what do you do if they're DUI marijuana? We got another problem with DUI marijuana is there is not a great curbside test to determine somebody's driving sobriety when they're under the influence of marijuana. So it's a very complex issue. And again, as Mike referred to, as some states, it's legal to have this marijuana. The next state, it isn't. So what do you do with an applicant from out of state who's not breaking any laws, but then they apply in your state? At one of the presentations I did a couple of years ago, we got on this subject, and there were about 120 people there, and they were mostly background investigators, in fact. And it was amazing to hear the differences in every state and sometimes cities in a state. And Mike and Sarah both have talked about this, is that it is all over the map in terms of, there was one that says one agency said it's mandatory to get some kind of like a marijuana, to do a polygraph and ask questions about marijuana, but you're not allowed to do anything with the information. And that was the most perplexing one at all. Why would you answer that? But others were much more relaxed on the subject of marijuana. On hard drugs, Schedule I drugs, cocaine, marijuana, and so on, they have a much higher addictive element. In many states, it used to be in California, mere possession, cocaine or an opiate was a felony. So now you're talking about felony possession, just possessing. So how do we transition from, hey, that crime's okay if, and that's that ultimately it's like many of the things we're talking about, including police hiring standards. I can talk about that too. And what we talked about as the current recruits, ultimately it's what the public wants. We serve the public. If the public says, including through your elected officials, whether the police like it or not, if they change the law, we got to abide by it. Mike mentioned about how these posts, these police officer standards of training across the country, many have a hard stop, like you cannot hire a person who's convicted of a felony, okay? You cannot hire him to be a peace officer. Well, what happens if they get that expunged? Well, then they're potentially, you see what I mean? But if there are other things having to do with drugs that are less defined. And so then you have where the agencies have to honor their state law or local law. And then secondly, things that are a little less defined. And frankly, the needs for additional police are affecting that. But I think ultimately what's really the deciding factor is what does the public want? I know this, that whenever we've had a deputy or police officer who gets arrested or involved in some situation, whether it's for being under the influence of drugs, buying drugs, selling drugs, whatever it might be, and then you look in their background and you go, whoa, look, here was the warning sign in the background. So we're between a rock and a hard place on this. That's my editorial comments.
No, I love that. And I love it because you tied in what I was hoping we were going to get to, which are specialized use cases for the NDI. But before I talk about that for a second, because I have a question for Mike and Brian. But my thought is with this, and let's take the drugs aside, because drugs is, like you guys have said, is super complicated, right? It's a very complicated one. Let's talk about something like battery. Is it battery? If I get into a fight at a bar, what is that in the States?
Assault.
Assault, something. Okay. So,
There-
Mike, you're muted, brother.
Are you talking about a fist fight in a bar with its mutual combat, or are you
Correct.
talking about
Correct.
taking a beer stein and hitting somebody
No,
upside
no,
the
no.
head?
Mutual, just fisticuffs.
Yeah,
Yes,
well, it's typically a misdemeanor battery or assault.
Okay. So,
but if the guy hits his head on a stool,
you're right, and bad stuff
and
happens.
if one
$1 million
guy,
babies it on us, yeah, I'm tracking.
well, and even if one guy's 30 and one guy's 80, then you say that's a felony elder abuse.
Right. So, but here's my point. Let's talk pre-employment. Right? Let's talk about that thing I brought up about nobody's been punched in the face before. Right? Would we not prefer as an industry? So when we have recruits that have gone through college and at some point during their college career, there's a record of them getting into fights at bars and campus police picked them up. They got these misdemeanor charges, whatever it is, all of that stuff. That stuff, is that something perhaps like, and that now this is just, I'm throwing this out there. From my perspective, that life experience is almost more of a positive than a negative. The fact that they have that experience is more of a positive than a negative and isn't seen necessarily as a bad thing because it was some type of crime, but because of the experience they gained because of it. So now that's obviously my personal opinion on that. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts.
Well, Adam, most of the states don't look at battery or don't look at getting in a fight. They look at misdemeanor arrests or felony arrests. That's what they gauge on. Now, in most states, a felony would prohibit you from being certified as a peace officer. Misdemeanors may or may not. It's going to depend on the circumstances, and then they'll get into that where they'll look at the circumstances. But whether or not getting in fights is a positive or negative, it's not looked at that way. It's the actual charges when they're arrested. You know, when I was a young boy in high school, I got into fights all the time, but I never got arrested. So I never had to face those issues when I got into law enforcement. So don't confuse those two. What the standards they usually look at is the actual arrest. And then they look at in misdemeanors the severity and the charges and how many times and it's just a lot of different factors are weighed in.
Many states look at it as, was it a youthful indiscretion that can be excused or waived, or is this a pattern of behavior that this person brings into adulthood?
And that pattern can be more than just the violence. The pattern can be about drinking. So, and did you learn your lesson? So the applicant got in this incident and they got in a bar fight and never happened again. So they learned their lesson. On the other hand, if the guy's got 3 or 4, it's difficult to imagine that that's not a pattern. And so, but then frankly, I would be more interested in the details if they were in the service at the time, out in the middle of nowhere, and the guy's got nothing else to do, but they're sitting around drinking and then start pounding on each other. It goes a little too far, but typically they're not going to get arrested for that. So ultimately you start with, like Mike said, is it a felony? Is it a misdemeanor? Were they arrested? And then secondly is, does your state have a prohibition of hiring that person? If it's a felony, probably not going to be able to hire them. If they were convicted, go get it expunged, through a judge and so on. Some states will give you a fighting chance. If it's a misdemeanor and not a pattern, and depends on the age, how long ago it was. If it was 6 months ago, I'm not excited about that. I'm going to say, hey, we need some more time to pass to know, was this just, a fluke? And every one of us has had some kind of fluke in our life. Gee, I wish that I had never gone to that party. I wish I had never talked to that person because it was a bad day.
And Adam, I want to say that it kind of goes back to our conversation in the beginning. I always tell people, I don't necessarily care what you do. I care more about why you do what you do. So if an 18-year-old has a conviction that resulted from selling marijuana. I'm going to ask why. Are you selling marijuana to get the new Air Jordans, or are you selling marijuana to feed the 4 siblings that you have at home because both of your parents are incarcerated? The fight. Did you punch someone because you have a problem with drinking, and it's happened 6 other times before where the police has been called, but you've maybe not been arrested? Or were you stressed out because your parents are going through a divorce and your kid brother just got diagnosed with cancer? There are so many things that go on in our lives as human beings that at times we have a hard time handling and a hard time dealing with. And I'm the last person on this planet to make excuses for people's behaviors and actions. But I think asking why is so important. And I believe it does justice for the applicant that is applying for the position, as well as the police department. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with the ACEs study. It didn't originate in Ohio, so I know that it's being taught and talked about nationwide about, we all have an ACEs score, and it's a series of questions. I don't remember if it's 10 or 15 questions, and the questions are very simple, like, have you ever been a victim of child abuse? Have you ever been a victim of verbal abuse? And basically, the higher your ACEs score, the more probability that you would suffer from things like cardiac arrest and heart attacks and obesity, because a lot of people don't understand that every single thing that happens in our environment when we're growing up, especially when you're a child, contributes to your physical and mental health. And I feel like we need to start asking more questions, not just when we're doing things like background investigations. Yes, the adverse childhood experience. Yep. You know what, Adam? I was shocked, but I wasn't, when I spoke at a conference with 120 people and I said, who in here knows? And it was law enforcement, just law enforcement. And I said, who in here is familiar with the ACEs score? And I about died because I saw one hand go up, one hand. And I think it made me so sad, because I feel like as police officers, we would do our job a lot more differently if we had knowledge. And, confidence comes from competence. So the more competent we are at our job as police officers, which in all reality, for the public, we're supposed to know how to do everything. I think it would cause us to treat the public differently. And I'll give you a quick example of why it's so important. One of the Syrian immigrants that I met on a traffic stop, he is 21 years old. When I tell you Syrian immigrants, I'm talking about he's been in this country for 3 years, and his parents and 2 little sisters just fled the war like a couple of years ago. They were moving. They've been living with somebody. They finally got government assisted housing, and they were moving, and they have a small 4-door vehicle. An officer stopped him because his plates expired like a week before. And he talked to him about his vision being obscured because of how many things were in his vehicle. They're moving their stuff. He didn't ask him nothing. Not, why didn't you renew your license? Why is your car for a close? Like, who are these people in the car? Nothing at all. And just wrote him a $180 ticket when they were struggling to make ends meet. And he said that he has never felt more invisible in his life. And for a Syrian refugee that just came into the country to say that, it truly broke my heart, because that officer could have took 5 more seconds and talked to him like, hey man, your license is expired. Why didn't you renew it? Oh, my family just came here from overseas. I'm too busy paying for this stuff. It's an obligation. I'm going to get it done ASAP. And I don't remember if he cited him for the whatever, because he couldn't see behind it when he was driving, but taking that 5 extra seconds and asking somebody why did you do this? Explain your actions to me, sheds light on people's behavior. And I think that that's another area where we are lacking in law enforcement.
Awesome. I appreciate the insight there, folks. I wanted to get, and this is the question I wanted to throw in there about the NDI. I'm wondering, and here's my question. Mike, you had mentioned that the NDI is not a blacklist, right?
Correct.
It's not like, hey, you're on the list, you're fucked. Like, that's not what it is. So is this an investigations tool that could be used? And I want to talk tools after this in a minute. And like, for example, like the ACEs survey you just brought up, is the NDI tool that can be used, for example, if an officer was terminated for cause in a state, for example, for recreational marijuana use, and then moves to a state where it's legal, and that's maybe not a factor that's going to determine their hiring in that state. Is that a use case for the NDI, for example, where if that officer was put in there for termination for cause in one state, when the other agencies doing the investigation on that officer hire, they can look that up and say, oh, it was for this, and we don't care. That's not a concern to us. And so now they've done their due diligence, but they have the information they need. Would that be an example of a use case that the NDI could be used for?
Right. Yeah, that is one of the examples that I've seen is an officer terminated in one state for a DUI on duty, one DUI. And another state would look at that and do an investigation and find out that it only happened one time. The officer got some needed help, hasn't drank for a certain period of time, and might go ahead and decide to hire them. So it, like you said, Adam, it is an investigative tool. And what they do when they call the post agency is they get the entire investigation, and what happened, what were the circumstances, and so forth, and use that to make a determination. They still have to follow the post rules in their state, whether or not the post would certify that officer if he's been decertified, he or she, in another state. And there's some states that have hard and fast rules, but in most cases, it's just an investigative tool. And if the circumstances don't apply in that, they can go ahead and hire that individual.
Is with the NDI, I mean, so here's the interesting thing. Obviously, IADLEST is an international organization, right? Yeah. I've jumped in. I'm an internationally accredited instructor through you guys, and we got that sorted out this year, which I'm very appreciative for. Okay. Is there a plan for IADLEST to share that system or bring that into a more international realm, or have that system put into other countries like Canada, other Commonwealth countries like Australia, the United Kingdom, and things like that? Or is it more of a US centric type of software?
You know, right now, that hasn't been a discussion item. And we haven't had that type of a request, but we're certainly open to it. I can tell you that, as the system sits right now, the only things that are in there are decertifications, where an officer has went through a hearing through a post commission, or they've relinquished their certification because of an investigation, or maybe they're under investigation. Those are basically the only things in there. We do have a committee put together that Brian chairs that is looking at adding some additional factors, such as an officer is terminated for excessive use of force. The officer has had due process. That's important. Not just an allegation, but they've had due process. They've been terminated or they've resigned, but they've not been decertified. We're looking at being able to add things like that into the NDI. Maybe court actions where civil judgments could be added in there. Also, what's interesting is almost all the states, but just a couple that I mentioned, have the authority to decertify, but the federal government, and you have a lot of federal agencies from FBI, Secret Service, Homeland Security, ICE, it just goes on and on and on. They don't certify. And you and I know that there's officers that are terminated at the federal level for misconduct. I just read one the other day. They're not in the NDI. And so we're also making arrangements to be able to enter that type of information, because as a background investigator, if you're hiring that individual, you need to know that. So we're trying to we're trying to make it as extensive as possible to have that information. But on the international level, you're right. We have about 18 countries right now that are members. Most of them academy directors. Most of them are national police organizations. They haven't approached us yet, but we're certainly open to seeing if we can find some way to make that possible if there's a real need.
Yeah, well, in my mind, and I've had conversations with other colleagues and stuff like that, and usually it's more on the academic component, but
Right.
just the ability to collect data on that system, like you had said, use of force.
Yeah.
If there's one thing that's laughable every single time I see it, it's the FBI's use of force data collection.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm just like, good for you. Like,
yeah,
it's a complete horseshit. So and again, the problem is because it's all self-reported, right? So you're getting whoever wants to put it in, puts it in, and it's the data isn't even close to correct most of the time. So, or at least not inclusive of the whole.
Yeah.
So that's one thing for sure with the NDI that I'd love to have further discussions on is that point exactly is what other data can you guys collect that's not that doesn't go against the core fundamentals of what that program is designed to do, but can assist in a lot of other things and not just in necessarily the investigative component, but in my mind, obviously from the training component, it's what have we identified that are that's occurring as a national, like as an industry or as a for law enforcement across the country. Hey, we're noticing an uptick in these types of incidents, right? The first thing that I go is awesome. Is that something we can address in training and how we do it? Right.
Yeah.
And so many different facets on how we can analyze and utilize information like that. And you guys have a system it's set up and potentially designed to do that. So that's kind of exciting. Brian, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, some of the national dialogue now is the call for a disciplinary database, clearinghouse for complaints against officers, and the usefulness of that is going to be limited, and the validity of it, in my opinion, is a very limited value because it takes very little to complain on an officer. The data that we wrestle with and the expansion that we're proposing for the NDI is all vetted by due process, be it from a court of law or the post entity itself, or if we get the federal agencies on board by that federal agency who's gone through their rules of employment law and said this person's been terminated for misconduct, and we're entering them into the database. So it's not a list that should concern officers that's going to follow them around just from raw information that's not been vetted in any way. And another thing, we try to market to more than just use this when you're hiring prior certified officers. Run every applicant through the NDI, because we've had actual stories, actual cases in which officers have been decertified in our state and they've attempted to re-enter the law enforcement profession, acting as if they've never been in law enforcement before. And a simple NDI query would have shown that past record. It's not unprecedented. So it's a great tool for all applicants, and every background investigator should use it.
If I could add on the NDI is that, us cops dislike bad cops more than anybody else. The public doesn't like bad cops. We don't like bad cops. And just because you're in that index doesn't necessarily mean a bad cop. But as Mike pointed out earlier, it's a pointer. Okay. It's not that somebody in California can punch up the IADLEST site and get all kinds of information. It's a name and date of birth that says you need to look at this. And so I'm a big fan of how it was put together. And California, who's pretty much ignored this forever, maybe I shouldn't say ignored it, has not participated. Is that in the last year, and I think you're going to see this across the country. It's already happened in a couple other states, and California has 10% of the population, so has 10% of the cops. Is that it's now mandatory for police agencies before they hire someone, they have to check the NDI. It's mandatory when certain circumstances occur, termination for cause and so on. They have to notify the NDI. I mentioned earlier about what the public wants, whether we're talking about hiring for police, firing for police, standards that we set, use of drugs. The public is in charge. And through their elected officials, and I don't always agree with them, by the way. Remember, I said I'm from California. Is that by making it mandatory, and I find in a reasonable way, and the fact that IADLEST has been on top of this for 2 decades, and California does trend, like it or not. You notice the trends across the country. I think you're going to see a lot more states doing this as well. But one of the reasons why they mandated it is because we weren't doing it voluntarily. But I digress sort of for just a moment, is on the training topic where we're talking about bias-free policing, de-escalation. My number one gripe, and everybody that's managed training for a police agency, I would venture 99.9% would agree, we don't object to the training and the training mandates. Frankly, we want the training. We're not opposed to doing the training. The problem is they are consistently unfunded mandates. So I have to decide out of my training academy, what am I going to cut in order to put in the unfunded mandate? What am I going to cut in advanced officer training in order to put in the unfunded mandate? Because I got a state mandate, county mandate. What am I going to cut? Because I have a shrinking budget. It doesn't pay for the officers to be taken out of the field for backfill overtime. It might pay for the instructors. Do I have the room space? All of that, but ultimately it costs money. And so I have to we call it take it out of hide. And you think about what take it out of hide means. That's like taking it out of your back. And so if our elected officials would put their money where their ballots are and say, we want these initiatives, we want training on de-escalation, we want training, and funded it as well for the full cost of the police agency, you would see police agencies across the country going, yeah, let's do it. Yeah, we're good. But in the meantime, every time, again, I was in charge of training for 17,000 people, plus assisting other agencies as well, is that I got to have, you got to give me the funding or I got to cut something. And typically the thing I cut a year or two later, it becomes the crisis. So, Bob.
Well, it's not only what you have to cut when you're talking about basic training, but even in service training, if there's a mandate to train on a particular topic, and especially if it's not funded properly, it's very expensive. Not only do you have to send the officer and you're losing that officer on that shift, or you're paying that officer to sit and go through training, you have to backfill that position. So now you're paying somebody else, and it's usually time and a half because it's overtime, and it becomes very, very expensive. And Mike, I just wanted to maybe clarify a couple of things. A few years back, we had 5 states that didn't have decertification authority. California, as you mentioned, was one of them. California years ago had decertification authority, but the unions, as I was told, the unions were strong enough at one time that they got legislation passed that prohibited California posts from decertifying an officer for misconduct. And it took all this time to reinstate that. And as you said, not only are they mandated to report any decertified officer to the NDI, also every agency in the state is mandated to check the NDI. Massachusetts, who just passed legislation as well, did the same thing. And every agency is authorized or mandated to check the NDI. But Massachusetts went a step further than any other state in the United States. With this new legislation, not only do they have to check every officer before they hire them, they're mandated to check every current serving police officer. There's 30,000 of them in Massachusetts. They have to be run through the NDI. And we're working right now trying to develop an automated program because there are so many. So somebody doesn't have to sit down and enter 30,000 names one at a time. We're gonna set up an automated program where they'll all be fed into the machine, and any hits will give a given back to them to, number one, whittle down, could it be this particular officer, and then they would start an investigation into it. But I think that is phenomenal that they're doing that checking on all the officers that are currently employed.
Barbara makes a comment that wouldn't a disciplinary record not be useful to identify trends? And absolutely, if we had uniformity in the reporting of disciplinary records, we'd certainly love to entertain that in the NDI. What needs to happen on that end is mandatory disclosure legislation in each state requiring agencies to disclose background checks without fear of defamation liability.
I wanted to add to that point too, with that whole idea. Right now, discipline records, I think there's a reason why we don't catch trends, and it's because we're not doing the right evaluations regularly enough with our officers. And there's something to be said when we talk about going back to the retention component, which is how do we identify what the officers want, right? How do we know what they're looking to do, what their career goals are, all that kind of stuff. All of those things happen during those personnel reviews. When I was with the forces, we did a PER twice a year. So every guy and girl in my platoon, I'd bring them in and I'd sit down with them and we'd go over any disciplinary issues. We'd go over what their goals are. We'd go over their training. We'd go over everything. And we'd touch on all of these points. And if they had multiple things that were issues that were brought up by either their section commanders or the platoon warrant or whatever it was, we'd address those. And again, the military is a special beast, but if we identified a history of issues, that person gets put on notice. Hey, listen, you're getting into hot water here. If you screw up again, there's a very good chance that you're going to get either, depending on what it is, up into including termination from the military, right? And leading, and not that they've done anything bad off the hop, but letting them know that we don't abide behavior like this happening over and over and over and over again. And if we nip it in the bud at the very beginning and say, listen, I'm not saying the next time you screw up, you're going to get canned. What I'm saying is if this pattern continues, that's the end outcome that you're going to see. It's the same thing in policing, right? But we're not good enough at identifying that at the beginning and having those conversations because they're hard conversations to have. And that's a leadership issue. But at the same point, in those conversations, we can identify, hey, to Sarah's point, why did this happen? Well, I'm disenfranchised because of X, Y, or Z. And we go, well, what would you rather? Is there something else you'd rather be doing? Is there something else you're passionate about? Can we channel all of this and put it into something that's going to benefit you and benefit us? Having those conversations, it starts off with a hard conversation, but it leads into that officer, that soldier in my case, feeling like they're actually valued, that they're being listened to, and then you get the best performance out of them that you can. And so I think that's an interesting conversation to have because you can loop in the disciplinary component with with their wants and needs for their careers all in one conversation. And so what do you guys think about that? Do you guys think I'm out to lunch? Or do you think there's some validity to that conversation?
I think there's a lot of validity to listen to the officers and make them feel that they're being heard. I think that's important. But, another thing I think that's really missing too is there's very little research into the tactics that we're teaching. We all teach a traffic stop or a handcuffing technique or a firearms certification course or whatever it might be, but there's very little real evidence on is that the best technique? Is there a better way to do it scientifically? And when you talk about the NDI, I just had somebody ask me the other day, has there been any research on the reason that officers are disciplined and decertified, and at what point in their career? Is it the first 5 years or whatever? And I think that's a big thing that's missing that could help in training as well as discipline and everything else. But Adam, I do agree with you that there's an opportunity. Like Sarah said, there's a missed opportunity in a disciplinary situation, in a termination, in a resignation, to be able to sit down and ask those questions and learn and listen to them and try to make those changes to make the officers feel that they're more valued.
Absolutely. Sarah, any last thoughts here before you jump off?
First of all, thank you so much for inviting me. I learned so much today, and I feel very honored and privileged to be amongst, a group of people that's very passionate about the profession. My last comments would be, don't let the distractions distract you. And I would hope that, men and women in blue and in every other uniform in public safety realize how lucky we are to wake up every day, not just in the United States of America, but in uniform. And what are we doing with that opportunity? And how are we helping not just our community, but one another? I think a big part of leadership and something that speaks to our character is how well we are willing to help others when there's no benefit to us at all. And I'll always believe that this is, the noblest and the greatest profession in this country. And we have a lot of work to do and a lot of room for improvement. And I believe that we're moving in the right direction and that we will continue to do good things.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time and joining us. It's been a pleasure, and look forward to having you on in the future. So stay safe, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. Take care, you guys. Take care.
All right. We're losing, folks. But hey, look at this screen. It's nice. It's perfect. Nice and clean. There was Robert just made a comment here. Agency leadership could take a cue from the corporate world, bringing in pulse surveys that measure wellness, culture, resiliency, and ask questions constantly to hear the voice of employees, using data to drive change in a positive direction. That's interesting. You guys, thoughts on that? Mike, you were shaking. Parker, you were shaking your head there. You're nodding your head. What do you think?
Oh, well, surveys make management nervous. I've noticed the best time to do a survey of your employees is when you get a new chief or sheriff, because then it's not their fault if the survey says the organization's a mess, right? So it would be nice if they all did that, but we don't even do it that frequently. I have seen some gutsy chiefs, though, that they'll do annual surveys. That might be a little too frequently, but every other surveys or something, they call them 360, where you ask, employees to rate their supervisors and so on. Yeah, there's people that they'll have their axe to grind and be petty and whatnot. But overall, you can test the mood of an organization. But I think the size of the agency is a big deal. If you have 15 total people, I don't know that a confidential anonymous survey is going to produce as much in the way of results. But importantly is there are a multitude of ways that you can get feedback from your employees. And I've mentioned several today, having to do whether it's an electronic survey like SurveyMonkey, and you have a organized, professionally done list of questions. You have where you just go up and actually just talk to people. Some chiefs and sheriffs, it's very natural for them, or commanders, whatever rank they might be. But, I think as a general rule, most police leaders are not real excited about walking up to somebody and anticipate and potentially facing the next 2 hours hearing this person unload, and then really not necessarily having received the training they need, because frankly, a lot of it is therapy. And so, and our problems go far beyond what's going on in the job. Often, I know I've talked to police psychologists, and they say they spend a huge amount of time dealing with officers' domestic issues, with their family, spouse, kids, so on. And so I guess what I'm driving at is that the key is, and Mike Becar, I heard him say it as well, is ask. So there's a number of different ways to ask. And And the point is to begin asking. You could read up on it on different varieties and find the way that is best for your agency. But again, I end with what I began with. It's really helpful if you do it when you've got a new chief or sheriff, because they're not as sensitive to the responses.
I might add to what Mike said, and I hesitate to talk on this because I'm not an expert in this area, but and with surveys and I equate evaluations, we've all taken a training class, and at the end of the class, they give you an evaluation to rate the instructor, to rate how well you might use the information, everything from how comfortable the room was, or on and on and on. And generally, they're maybe a 1 to 5, 1 being poor, 5 being great, and so forth. Those are terrible. They don't really give you any real data. And we just did a webinar on an expert in that really opened my eyes as to how poorly those things are, and how to do a really good evaluation. And I would equate that with a survey. We don't have a survey wing at IADLEST. We usually contract that out if we're doing research on a particular area. But there are so many different ways to write a question that'll get all different types of responses. So you have to be very, very careful. But again, I don't want to talk about that because I'm not an expert and I can't give you the real advice on what works and what doesn't work. I would defer to the experts on that. But I think, in my personal feeling, is that one-on-one communication, if you really listen to somebody, and that's a key. A lot of us don't really know how to listen, but you have to really listen and hear them out. And I think you'll learn a lot in any situation, whether it be disciplinary or resignation or what have you, like what Mark was saying, or Mike was saying.
We've covered a lot of things in this conversation today, right? From the assessment, new recruits, officers transferring over. We've talked about retention, officers on right now, disciplinary measures. What I'd like to do as we kind of tie this thing together, and I'm happy to stay on and have this conversation. And if anybody has any other questions right now, please put them in the chat so we can address them while we're here. But I want to kind of open up the floor. Is there anything that you guys think that we haven't touched on today when it comes to retention and recruitment that should be talked about in the industry right now? Is there anything that's being swept under the rug that isn't getting the daylight that it needs?
Well, I'll start with, we have to change. The applicants are the applicants. They are who is available and existing, and getting frustrated. The most frustrated people actually on our hiring are retirees. Like, oh, in my day. And our day is over. We have a new generation, and we've talked about a few of the negatives that we perceive from the incoming generation. But I'd say some of the positives is that they're I believe, as on the average, they're more compassionate than my generation. They are completely intolerant of bias. They will not tolerate bias at all. And these are some good things. Like, we want officers who are not biased. We want officers who are compassionate. And so I think it was Mike that talked about, we can train somebody in defensive tactics and interpersonal skills. It's tough. We're not used to doing that. And my generation kind of grinds us like, I can't believe we're having to teach this. But the fact remains is that you have to focus on reality. And whenever I hear this from a police executive where they're very resistant to making these changes that they need to make, they say, well, we do this, and we do that, and I say, well, how's that working for you? It's not. Our applications are down 70%. So my brother, who's an international businessman, says, when your business is failing, you have two choices: change or go out of business. So our business is not healthy when it comes to hiring and retaining. So we need to change. Part of that change is to change our methodology from inviting and encouraging people to join us, and then to guide them through the application process, and doing what my generation would look at as coddling them. But it's really not. It's that our generation is the one that put these in their hands. And so they're used to this constant interactive comment. So am I now. And, I'm no kid. So I guess that's my punchline is we have to change. The applicants are not going to. Okay. Also, add to the dilemma is the number of younger people is less than it was in my generation. So there's still this huge population, the graying of America, but the number of young people is less and going to be less. And it was exacerbated by the pandemic over the last 2 years. The birth rates are way down. You got countries that have negative birth rates. So we're going to have even less people to potentially hire. And that's going to cause a change in what police can do. Automate filing misdemeanor reports with non-workable information has become quite common, and other things like that. And there's police agencies that, especially in large cities, that are telling people to lower their expectations. We went from do more with less to do less with less. And so this is part of the change that our society is going through. But I can tell you that it's not just about money, but there are some changes that could be made. But the people and elected officials don't want to finance those. But if they did, I know it would help. But ultimately, again, I'll close with that same thing I started with is we need to change as police officials and police leaders and be more inviting. Marketing is about drawing people in, be better at marketing, inviting, and guiding in a way that appeals to our applicants.
Mike, I'd take it a step further. Yes, we need to change, but it's not just marketing. Sarah made a good point when she was talking about the bilingual people that are out there that could make very good police applicants, but sometimes they can't even drive down to take a test. Are we thinking about that? Are we making arrangements to go to them rather than requiring everybody to come here, come there, do this test and things like that? I think we need to really make those types of provisions. Another thing we need to look at is the hiring process. In many cases, it takes way too long. And by the time the officer is waiting, or the individual, not officer, is waiting, they're given 2 or 3 other job offers and you've just lost them. So we need to find ways to streamline that. We definitely need to change in many, many aspects, but I think step out of the box and do things entirely different than what we're doing today.
Yeah, to add what you just said, Mike, on the subject of immigrants, for example, because you have to study the applicants, like what's their reality. So you mentioned about the transportation could be an issue, especially if you don't have a lot of money. So 2 things I'll bring up about immigrants. One is selective service. All young men in the United States, still only applies to men, are required to apply for or to. It's basically the draft. People say, "Oh, the draft." No, it's selective service. There is no draft, but it's in case we have to do a draft. Well, all young men in the United States have to apply or submit their documents for selective service. I forget now. I think it's by age 23, 25. I forget now. Well, what do you do with an applicant that didn't do that? What message does that send? Is it they're not loyal to the United States? Is it that, why did they not, which is a law, it's mandatory. And it has to do with the national defense. So, okay, well, you're not going to file for selective service, but you want to be a cop? So in some states and some jurisdictions, mine included, that's an issue. So the question is why? Why did they not file? What we found was there's a higher percentage with immigrants because they just didn't know. Dad, grandpa, their uncle never mentioned anything about this. And when they see some form of the DMV or something, they're like, well, that doesn't apply to me. So that's where you get into the why. Oh, this person didn't apply because they just didn't know. They got a single mom who's from Central America. She's like, I don't even know what that is. So deny that person the ability to be a peace officer. It wasn't personal. It's not like they were in charge of the I Hate America's Club, and that's why they didn't file. And now a year later, all of a sudden, they love America because they want a job. So that's just one example that you wouldn't know to look for. But if you're studying percentages and why are you weak in the hiring of women, why are you weak in the hiring of immigrants, you discover things like that. Another thing has to do with the family's influence in immigrant families is significantly higher on average than somebody who's a third generation American. And they're typically coming from a country where the police are not looked upon favorably. And we being my generation's mindset is, if a mom comes with her son or daughter to a recruitment event, and we kind of look at that as, wow, this guy didn't even come here by himself. He brings his mommy with him. We look down on that. But I will tell you, within the immigrant community, it's a sign of respect from the son or daughter that they're involving the mother or the father in this decision. They respect the parents for what they've been through. That's a good thing. We like respect. And so my eyes were open at a couple of recruitment events. And like I said to this one deputy, I said, I notice a lot of these applicants have moms or dads with them. What do you think about that? And I thought he was going to say something sarcastic like somebody my age would say. And he says, oh, that's a good thing because, when they see that we're a diverse organization, they see that we're this, I'm talking to mom in Spanish, these kinds of things. They say, okay, well, if you're going to be a cop, be a Los Angeles County Deputy Sheriff. So there's that connection there, and you can do that on the internet as well. So my point is that especially with the immigrant communities, you want to make the family, you want to invite them to be part of that process. You want to show them the respect that the son or daughter is showing their parent. Whereas my reality was, they're not being an adult, but that has changed. It's a different thing, and it's particularly different for immigrants. So there's a long list of these kinds of things, but you'll find that if you study them and you shine a light on them, you'll start noticing these things. I'll make this observation on the subject of women. Explorer programs, and I wrote an article for Sheriff Magazine on Explorer programs, but Explorer programs, if you look at them across, youth Explorer programs, they're open to typically 13 to 20-year-olds. If you look at the ranks of the youth Explorers, they're about 50-50 with boys and girls, about 50-50. It's more girls and boys. What happens between 15, 16 years old and the hiring of female officers that we're stuck at 13% in the United States for the last couple of decades? Why do we go from 50% who are so interested in it, they're putting a uniform on and participating as an explorer, and that for some reason drops to 13%? And we've been stuck at 13% for decades nationally. And lastly is, why is it that the UK, Canada, Australia, and other countries, why did they go from 13% 15, 20 years ago, and now they're at 35%? What did they do? And what they did was, one, they had a plan. Now, I'm not a proponent of reverse discrimination or anything. I'm saying they had a plan to let the female applicants know that they're welcome and to remove unnecessary barriers. And now they're very focused on a more diverse organization. So anyway, punchline is there are solutions, but you got to work at it. And really, the larger agencies owe it to the smaller agencies to work this out, because they have the economies to scale to be able to really focus on this and then share those lessons learned with the smaller agencies. And in this subject, recruitment, there are dozens of countries doing way better than the United States, and we need to learn from them.
You brought up about 14 different rabbit holes that we could jump down, so I appreciate that. And I'm gonna let the other two guys jump down any one of those they want. But something that you had said kind of struck home with me, so I want to bring this up. I don't know about the selective service thing. Obviously, that's not something we have in Canada. But it's interesting because it brought up the idea of, in the military, we have this concept of soldier first. Doesn't matter what trade you are, everyone's a soldier first, which means you're combat trained. You know how to use a rifle. You know how to, if shit hits the fan, you're a soldier first. Doesn't matter if you're a clerk, if you're a mechanic, if you're a cook, doesn't matter. You're a soldier first. In the law enforcement field, we have that same mentality. You're a police officer first, right? You have to come in as a sworn police officer. You do your training, you do your firearms training, you do patrol, and then you can go out and do your specializations after you've gotten some core fundamentals of what policing actually is, and you have some experience. I've had this conversation multiple times over the last 2 years, some on podcasts, some on these roundtables. Is it time to start hiring people for specific roles that they excel at? Example, you brought up technology and how the new generation is phenomenal with technology. There's also a lot of this new generation that we know are very much not into interpersonal conflict. Therefore, they say, I'd love to be I'd love to do cybercrime investigations, but I don't want to ever carry a gun. And maybe they're the best, maybe they could be the best cybercrime investigator that we know, but because they're not willing to come in and we say, you have to do this. Is it time to maybe separate the two and hire specifically for positions that are maybe out of scope of a armed police officer role, and hire them for specialty roles within police departments to do tasks that don't involve them being armed or having to go do patrol duties? And so that's my question to you guys. Do you think we're at that point? Do you think that'll never come? Do you think that doesn't make sense? What do you guys think of that concept?
I think it makes sense, but it's not reality in the United States. Generally, the average police department around the United States is 10 people or less. So we don't have those specialized units, and they have to work the streets. The vast majority of them are smaller agencies. And sure, you have the big NYPDs, the LAPDs, the Chicago PDs that might be able to do that sort of thing, but there's not that many agencies. And so we have to kind of look at the whole, and I just don't see those opportunities. I see a lot of people say, they want to be a detective. They don't want to go on patrol, but in the vast majority of the average agencies, you've got to have that experience before you're an effective detective. Can you bypass all of that and train? I don't know, maybe. You'd have to convince me. I think the biggest issue in all the years that I was doing training was I could train in pretty much any skill they wanted to have me train in, but I couldn't train an officer in common sense. And you see those new officers that will make a traffic stop and everything is by the book, period. And then once they get some experience, all of a sudden that traffic stop changes a little bit, and they're listening and they're weighing the circumstances, and they might determine that a warning would be just as effective as a ticket, or as one of the other people mentioned, the poor immigrant that is stopped and given a $160 ticket when they don't have the money and they got all their possessions in the car. That's the hardest thing to train, is that common sense. And so they kind of have to acquire that through years of work on the job. And if there's a better way to train in that, I've not seen it yet, but I'm open to see if that works. But that's where I see the difficulty in what you're saying, especially in the normal smaller agencies.
Yeah, I sure agree with Mike. I'll add that I come from an agency that was 43% civilians. So out of 17,000 people, 10,000 are sworn, 7,000 are civilians. But because it's a sheriff's office, there are additional opportunities that aren't necessarily for a police department, like within the jails and clerical functions. And like you said, with analysis, computer type functions and so on. The same with what Mike mentioned about in order to be a detective, you need to have some police experience. And I was on the job when we civilianized dispatchers and the complaint desk. You know, when you call 911, who answers the phone? When you call the business line, who answers the phone? When I hired on, they were deputy sheriffs with few exceptions. And during my career, those all transitioned to civilians. So we thought that was going to be the end of the world. Like, hey, there's no way that they're going to be able to handle this. But it took time. It took time. And that there's a challenge there. That's a huge recruitment and retention issue is dispatch, 9/11 dispatch and so on, in large part because of the shift work. It's very stressful work, and it doesn't get recognition that it deserves. And then secondly, the shift work. And it doesn't pay as much as being a peace officer. So those most experienced people, their goal is to get off of late night shift and get on to day shift, and then maybe work their way into another position. So one of the things that the LA Sheriff did was they diversified what that payroll title would allow you to do. So it wasn't just working the dispatch desk. It was also like fleet management. Who's in charge of making sure that all the cars that are managed, you get enough of these patrol cars, somebody's got to do air traffic control and all that. So believe it or not, that same position can do that. And so what it does is it helps with retention, because as they're hitting that burnout stage, they're thinking, hey, I can go get a day shift schedule and manage the fleet. Mm-hmm. But Mike hit the nail on the head when you're talking about 10 employees or 10 officers in an agency. There's only one thing they do, and that's be a cop. And so it's really, your question, Adam, is pretty much reserved for mega large agencies or even medium-sized agencies. But Mike would probably know better than I, but I think in terms of total peace officers in the United States, 800,000, I think about half work for an agency that's less than 15 officers, right? But then there's huge numbers that work for large agencies. Right. And so, yes, and I think that there's been a lot done in terms of civilianization, but ultimately is that to give somebody a badge and gun and they don't have any police training, that doesn't make sense to us, because the expectations are going to be that they act on those. They're going to take action, including by the public. But as a civilian, they can do a lot. And the civilians, they're kind of like, I don't know if they have it in Canada, but in the military in the US, they have warrant officers. And my understanding is this is a specialist in a particular field, and there's 3 ranks of warrant officers, but they're a specialist and they devote their career in that specialty. And so detectives are a good example of somebody who devotes and becomes awesome, hopefully, at being a detective. But without any background, it takes a while before you get schooled up enough where you can do your job well. But again, open to it enough that 43% of my former agency is civilian.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the feedback. I like I said, it was just a question, because that's people were getting or changing. Everything's changing, right? Like you had said, Mike. So do you guys think we're having enough of these types of conversations where we're saying, hey, what if? And throwing, kind of like taking a handful of spaghetti, chucking it at the wall and seeing what sticks. Like, is there, because there's these ideas out there. Who do you think we are going to get these new ideas from to start changing the culture within our agencies, to changing the way that we do recruitment? Do you think that we should be doing more to reach into our agencies and pull information out of our officers that are currently there? And is there a way to do that? Is there a way to say, hey, listen, what would you say to somebody who asked you right now, if, like, for example, Carter brought up, he said 7% of officers recommend being a police officer right now. So what happens when that officer's on the road and somebody asks them a question about, are you hiring or should I become a police officer? Then they're saying, no, I don't think you should. Is there a way to counter that within the agency first before that happens?
Well, I heard multiple questions in there.
I did ask you like 3 questions there, so pick one. Go ahead.
But that's okay. I'm doing the same thing. So Mike mentioned earlier about there needs to be more evidence-based studies on what it is we're already doing now. What happened over the last couple of years is politicians rose up and did knee-jerk reactions to, well, we need to defund the police, and we need to do this, and they had absolutely no proof that any of this works, right? But frankly, we don't have a lot of proof that it works either. We police have experience and we believe it works, but we welcome the academics to study this, okay? And those that I think those in policing that weren't really welcoming to it over the last couple of years have been eat like pinata with these ideas that somebody thinks of. I don't know. They wake up in the morning and go, I got an idea. Here, go spend millions of dollars and hundreds of hours sorting this out with no real proof that it works. So I think that we've really changed too as a police culture, is that we want these evidence-based studies to say whether it's training on de-escalation, use of force. I mean, the studies and numbers that are coming out about body-worn cameras, what is coming out is that, hey, maybe this really isn't having an impact on use of force. Okay. It's not really definitive right now, but it seems to be heading in that direction. But frankly, if the only result was that it built public trust, that would be good enough for me. If it helped the officers in some way, that would be good enough for me. But it may not be getting the result that it got funded for. And so ultimately it doesn't seem to be a long line of entities, probably because they're not funded, to do studies on police that what we're doing or training actually works. And then instead of just leaving it that, like, nah, you're doing it wrong, what is the correct way? And then I think you'd see a lot of support from policing, because we want to do the right thing. We want to do what the public wants. We want to do a good job. We want to reduce fear, reduce crime. Anyways, so you notice I slipped in there the unfunded mandates again.
No, I love that. Real quickly, before anybody else jumps in here, Barbara made a really interesting point in the comments here. She said they have a program where if an officer identifies and mentors a candidate who eventually gets hired, the officer is rewarded with time off. That's interesting. I think incentivize it. I think finding ways to incentivize our officers to be involved is phenomenal. So it's a great way to do that. Actually, this brings up another point to the technology side of things. I know Toronto police and a lot of the agencies in Ontario up here are very good at allowing their officers to utilize social media for community relations. And in fact, I know one officer who's retired now, but he had a following on TikTok. He did everything in uniform. It was all run through the department, but he would make posts and he would have over 1 million views on their posts every time he would make posts. And it was phenomenally effective, especially with community relations, but also creating that touch point with that new generation that sees officers in a completely different light, where they're doing things that are enjoyable or fun or showcasing the officer in a different light. I think that's an interesting way to go about it, but I think there's also this huge misunderstanding that if somebody goes on social media, that it's going to turn out bad, right? Like, why would we put ourselves in that realm if we don't have to, kind of mindset? And so what are your guys' thoughts on that? The use of social media to drive recruitment, utilizing officers and their ability to use the platforms. Do you think that's something that's that people are shifting towards, or do you think that agencies are afraid to use it still because it's more of an unknown?
I think it's being used more. We're using social media like we never have before, and we have a lot of following. But I know that there's a lot of training out there where law enforcement officers are going to social media and making comments that lead to a lot of problems, both for them and the agency. And in hiring, there's a lot of emphasis on checking an individual social media accounts before they hire them to see some of the comments they're making. So what I would say is, And I think it could be extremely beneficial in recruitment, but it would have to be monitored very closely. You'd have to have the right person, and it would have to be sanctioned by the agency, and the agency would have to be aware of what's being done, what's being put out. But if it was done in that way, that's a tremendous way to reach the younger generation that's out there right now, because that's what they're looking at. That's what they live by, is TikTok and things like that.
It's absolutely unexplored territory. When we post public information, it's one of the more viral things in our state government system, to see the reaction to just good information that's out there. Like Mike said, it needs to be controlled and vetted, but I think largely it's unexplored. I think we've just had the tradition in law enforcement of not communicating very well, especially in times like these, and not explaining the realities of uses of force and different situations that we handle. And when we can control it and put a positive spin on it, it's unbelievable the reaction that we get. Just COVID brought us to the necessity of virtual public events, and then we're never going to get away from it. We find like our graduation exercises were attended by 1,000 people in person, and now the viewership's much higher than that, and the 1,000 people have returned as COVID wanes. So I think it's just an uncharted territory that we could explore and exploit.
Yeah, I'll add that in the few minutes we have left, I can't cover all the answer to that, but I will say that I was put in charge of the press office in 2009 and have been on Twitter, Facebook, and all the others ever since. And so using it as a press office, and then later on using it for recruitment. So I'll explain this way: as your number one, recruiters are your own people. Number two, recruiters, social media. There's a formula to this. It includes today the use of video. Instagram is king, queen. Facebook number two. Twitter in terms of recruitment, not really a plus. I'm not a fan at all of TikTok or things like that. Nothing against TikTok, although there are things to complain about with that, because it doesn't preserve, certain systems don't preserve what you shared, right? And you have to be able to preserve your share in case public comments. But so going back to the key part is what I train my guys to do is don't try to make the big splash, the super fantastic video, be the star officer, like you said. Just have a steady drumbeat of quality information about the hiring process. What's the academy like? What are the job opportunities like? And the LA Sheriff's Department, if you go to the LASD recruitment Instagram, for example, there's hundreds of videos on there. And I commission them, say, make them all 59 seconds or less. Why? Because Instagram cuts off at 60 and things like that. And then feature officers, feature what we do, and do these little brief highlights. Show what the academy's like, what the hiring process is like. Make it explanatory, because your boring text-only website sucks. And nope, that you're competing with these cat videos, so you got it that are hilarious. I know my wife shows me every one of them. And they are funny, the dog ones too. So you need to be interactive. So once somebody makes a comment, like, so you post it on your social media for your recruitment. If you're a large agency, you'd have dedicated recruitment social media. But when they make a positive comment or like, oh, that's so cool, you comment back. Or they say, wow, I was always thinking about becoming a deputy. Then you comment back, oh, well, our next hiring exam is such and such date. What that leads to is a one-on-one conversation on social media, which leads to them picking up a phone and calling us, which is the reverse, because the old days, it was like you put out an ad and then they call. Call is the last thing they do. Social media is where you establish that relationship. So that was the best I can do in 5 minutes. But I'll tell you, there is a formula to it. And several of you have pointed out, there's also landmines and a minefield. So you need to have a guide and a metal detector to make sure you don't step on a mine.
Thanks, brother. I'm going to give everybody here an opportunity to go around the horn and kind of give your final thoughts on all of this. First thing I want to do is I want to give a shout out to everybody here in the chat who you guys have stuck around. You guys are awesome. Thank you. Barbara, obviously, a huge shout out to you and your department. I know all the stuff you guys have been putting up with over the last couple of weeks, and finally that's resolved. So shout out to you guys for the awesome job you guys did. And thanks for being engaged in the chat. There is a lot of things that we talked about here. There's a lot of context that we weren't able to dive into because of the platform and the time frame. I would welcome anybody to reach out. If you have questions for anybody here on this panel, obviously you can find pretty much all these guys on LinkedIn. Obviously, if you want to reach out to IADLEST, you can go to the IADLEST website. You want to get a hold of Mike, I know you can find him on LinkedIn, or any of our other guests. You can reach out to us directly here at ILET, and I will definitely facilitate that conversation with you guys for them. And we can keep this conversation rolling. Obviously, there's going to be a lot more coming out with ILET, with everybody here on this panel, and looking forward to putting more information and training out there for you guys. So with that being said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give everybody a chance to kind of give your last thoughts. And then I'll do a quick goodbye here. I'll ask our guests to hang on for a quick AAR after we cut the live feed, and yeah, we'll go from there. So Mike, Becar, why don't we start with you, brother? Any last thoughts or feelings on the conversation we've had today?
Thank you. I thought it was outstanding. Both the audience, the questions that you've been asking, and the panelists were superb. I learned a lot, and I can't emphasize that recruitment right now and retention are critical issues. We're all dealing with it. Every agency is struggling. We have to change. It's been said over and over and over. We have to step out of the box. We have to do things differently. Go out to the public. Your officers are your best resources. Use social media in a responsible way. Just do things differently. And this is an extremely noble profession. I salute everyone that risks their lives out there every day and stay safe. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Brian?
Well, I'll just have to reiterate what Mike said. This has been enlightening in many ways. I enjoyed the feedback from the chat, and got some good thoughts there. But yes, this is a noble profession that many need to explore.
Awesome. Thanks, man. Mike Parker, last but not least.
I want to thank you, Adam, for you did a fine job of herding these cats, and Mike and Brian and all the fellow panelists. Thank you very much for your insight. I always learn something, and you know what they say, when you decide that you're done learning, you better get the heck out of the profession, because we always have something new to learn. And especially thank you to the audience. I wish we could have used the chat room and responded. Barbara, in particular, you really made so many good points. Robert, others made many great points, and I found this very enjoyable and a great discussion. So thanks, and thanks to all of you that are still out there risking your life for all of us, including my family and my friends. God bless you.
Awesome. And so a huge thank you, obviously, to our panelists, every single one of you guys that joined us. It was a phenomenal conversation we had tonight. As always, this is going to this whole session will live on. You can go back and access this whenever you would like on the ILET channels on YouTube, and we'll have it on our platform. And we'll break this thing up into manageable components via the podcast and other platforms as well, so we can kind of hyper focus in on certain topics that we discussed throughout the 3 hours here today. Every month, we're going to be running one of these roundtables. And so make sure to join us, subscribe to ILET, whether it's on YouTube, Facebook, or just follow us. You come join the community when we open it up here later this month. And you can expect more and more stuff coming out of us this year, including new partnerships like that with IADLEST, and just trying to bring the best training, the most actionable, relevant training to as many officers as possible. That's our goal here. And of course, to try to change the standard of law enforcement across the board. So thank you to everybody for taking the time and joining us here on today's IRT on retention and recruitment. And we'll see you again soon. Stay safe.